All right. Thanks for being here today. Here today with DM Needom, and she's a writer, podcaster, musician, among other things.
Former
But
musician, not so much a musician now, but go ahead.
I feel like that's kind of like once a musician, always a musician. So we'll go with former, but we'll definitely talk about hitting the bass later. With
Okay.
your podcast that you do, I was just listening to your newest episode this morning, and I haven't listened to all 150 published episodes yet, but I've listened to the first few and then some in the middle and then some at the end and then that new one today just to see how it's progressed as you've gone on, because 150 episodes, that's good. And I understand that you probably have a lot more episodes than 150. That's just the 150 that were published.
As you know, as a podcaster, sometimes you create an episode and maybe the content isn't quite up to snuff. So you decide whether you want to release it or not. And there's been a few that will never see the light of day. So,
Okay.
so what was your impression, if I may ask?
I liked it. The first one, I usually, if I'm talking to somebody that does podcasts, I'll try to find their first one and listen to it, just because that's kind of closer to where I'm at on the scale of podcasting.
Okay.
And I like that it opened with the drums, and the new one that you have with the Fast Susie song. I like that one too. That sounds good. But I liked your opening, and I like the conversational format of it. So it's easy to listen to. I think if you the big thing for podcasts for me when I listen to them is, do you feel like you're in the room during the conversation? So that's what I felt listening to your podcast. And I've listened to more than one, and all of them, like I didn't just listen to a few minutes of one. I listened to the whole thing.
I
So
appreciate that. I do appreciate
I,
that.
I like the format. I can see the changes as you go on, and I can just in this podcast between, I think this one is the 25th one. So just seeing the changes that I've made, the little tweaks here and there, things I've learned going through those first 25, I can only imagine how much more you know at 150 episodes. So,
Well, to be honest, I have a radio background. I used to be an on-air personality for two different radio stations back in the 90s. So my sound guy, Rich, who was in that most recent interview as well, he's my producer as far as audio. So he created the audio content as far as editing and everything else. But
mhm.
how this all came about was he knew that about me. And I'm friends with his wife, and that's how I met him. And he's like, "Why aren't you doing podcasting?" And I was just kind of like, why would I do podcasting? And then I had an idea to do podcasting, and my husband wasn't in on it, and I wanted to do it with him, especially because at the time he was going through his final years. So I thought we could have an interesting podcast based on that. But he never had the gumption to do it. So after he passed, I was a guest on somebody else's podcast, and that kind of just moved me along the way. So it's been an adventure, because when you were talking about the changes, when I actually cringed watching my very first episode of it, because it is me, and I saw all the mistakes I made. And while it is an important topic, because it was about saving my mom, it still was a little bit. You start being your own worst critic. So when
Mhm.
I did all the highlight reels for leading up to the 150th episode, at first I was going to like, oh yes, I'll put me at the beginning saying this is where I started. But quite honestly, it's like, no, I'm too embarrassed by that. Even though I will not take it down because it's a decent episode, I critique myself. And that's why I would not reshare that episode. Even though it's a good episode, I know my mistakes. And as a person, as a creator, you understand that as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's like the first, like the little commercial you do for your podcast, your 1 minute thing, that is much different than this one is now. So, and I was like, do I leave it up there or do I take it down? And it's up there now. So I don't think I'll take it down. It's not something that, I mean, it's, it was a different idea when that started to what it is now. And I'm happier about what it is now. But,
Well, I mean, when I started the podcast, it came to me because yes, my books are the Better to Burnout series, And I realized at a certain point that everybody's got a better to moment, that moment where you sit there and go, hey, was it better to have done this than not? And so for about the first 4 or 5 seasons, that's what I focused on, was this better to moment that most people had gone through. The problem was I started dealing with a lot of people who left their job and went on to be an entrepreneur. And while it is a fantastic endeavor and I appreciate all that, at a certain point your podcast becomes repetitive and you're not going to have the people listening. Now, I will say this, even when I've taken long hiatuses or whatnot, I have somebody in Germany that will come back every week to see if there's a new episode or not. I was gone for 8 months, and every week they still were hitting the last episode to see if I had uploaded. And this morning, the first group that checked out the new episode were them. So I
Nice.
have a little German fan club over somewhere,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay,
You're like David Hasselhoff. You're just big in Germany.
maybe.
Yeah. With the when I looked at your podcast or listened to them more appropriately, I listened to them on Spotify because that's where I do most of the podcast stuff because it's just on my phone. It's easier to go in and you have all the things. How'd you make the decision to not do video on Spotify?
Originally, when I started out, I started doing Anchor, and then I moved to a different hosting platform, Buzzsprout. And Buzzsprout does not allow to do that. So I could go back and put video, but then I don't have I would have to download every video off of YouTube and then replace it on Anchor through Spotify. And so that
Wow.
is the reason I have not done it. I could do it with season 8. I could go in there and start with season 8 and do it that way, but I haven't decided whether I want to do that or not. All my videos for the podcast are up on YouTube. So,
Okay. And I found there are a lot of little things, especially starting, and it sounds like it's just there's a lot of decisions to make even after you've been doing it a while, where you're like, I need to figure out what I can do and keep it under control. Like, don't get scheduled too far out. Don't do too many clips. Like, if you're doing a show and you're like, I'm going to do 12 clips of this show and post it twice a day on whatever social media, that I started out doing 6 clips because I was doing Wednesday to Wednesday for releases. And I was trying to get something on Instagram and X and YouTube every day. And then the full episodes on Wednesdays. And then I'm down to 2 clips per episode now. And that's more manageable. So I think it's one of those things where I always look at the big podcasters and they have the staffs and everything that can do all those separate things. And I go, I would never use that. But now that's when I was starting. But now I think, oh, I can see why you have that, why you have a show scheduler, why you have a producer, why you have all those other things. So you can just concentrate on this part.
I mean, last year, I think it was last January, I at one point had 4 podcasts going.
Hmm.
Um, and one was with a co-host. We did a live show on Saturdays. That didn't last very long. I did an intuitive podcast where I did weekly intuitive readings, just in general, a general weekly reading. So that was a brief podcast. And then I had this great idea about doing a podcast based on people with their soundtrack of their lives. The only problem with that is you can't, it comes down to licensing of music. So while I
Yeah.
recorded them, I never actually released them because I couldn't get Spotify. If you're a member, if you're a Prime, you have the full paid membership, then that podcast would link those songs in. If you did not have that, you couldn't hear the music. And at a certain point, it's kind of like, well, there's no reason to do the podcast. So I released, I think, one episode with that, and that was about it. And it was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. And then the other podcast with the co-host, I got basically to the point where I burned myself out. And
Hmm.
so I took an 8 month hiatus basically from my show. And it was like, I finally brought it back in August. And I was glad I did because I needed that break and I needed to retool and restructure what I wanted to do with it.
What were how different is it doing a podcast with a co-host? Just in general, not
And I know,
specifically
I'm
maybe.
just, um, It's okay doing it with a co-host. I think the problem is when you have a co-host that is not as tech savvy as per se yourself, and they have an issue with their mic or something, and you're live and they start basically freaking out. That can be a problem. But all in all, I think if you have a co-host that you get along with well and that is tech savvy enough, there aren't the problems with it. It flows smoothly. It goes well. There's a friend of mine who has been a guest on my show, I think 3 or 4 times now, and every time she's on my show, everybody talks about how great the show is because we have that rapport. So I think if you have a good natural rapport with somebody, a co-host is not a problem. It's when you have somebody that your rapport is not totally there, and the tech issues. If they don't know how to handle something professionally when a mic goes out, you know, because the person I was with, their mic did go out and they freaked out, and in another episode my mic went out, and they're like, well, I guess I just have to take over the whole episode, and I'm just like, and I unplugged my mic and just went with my laptop mic. Sure, it sounded bad, but we're on live, and you can't freak out. I mean, this is, dare I say, this is a professional choice you're making, so you have to be professional. You can't just have a meltdown on screen
Yeah.
because it'll look bad.
Do you do a lot of your episodes live, or do you record them and then release them?
I record them and release them. I mean, the only time I did live was with the co-host, and I've been told I should do them live, but with scheduling, this is the thing. You're dealing with your schedule, you're dealing with their schedule, and so you're not going to necessarily always have that exact time to go live. Because somebody may not be available till 7 o'clock at night, and so are
Yeah,
you suddenly going to do a live show at 7 o'clock at night when this isn't a normal release time?
that's a good point. I could see doing live if you had some support where somebody was looking at messages being texted in or whatever. I don't see the advantage of being live unless it's interaction with the people that are watching or listening. But I can't imagine trying to work that while I'm doing this and then looking at a text screen and responding or anything.
It was complicated. I mean, there were times when people would comment, and I'm trying to. And the other thing about it is, if somebody's in the middle of some talking, and then suddenly you get a question, and they're continuing to talk for another 5 minutes, that question may become irrelevant. But you want to get back to the guest, and you have to, or get back to the question, so you have to pull that in. And while you're trying to do that, then there's the option, especially like in StreamYard here, where you can do highlights of the question and put the question up there. And so it's great if you have an assistant, but if you're doing this while recording, it's not that easy. So it'd be much easier to do a live show if you have the assistant. And you were talking about booking. I use a booking software because I know that if you're constantly going back and forth with somebody, it's not easy for you. Where a booking software, you set your time and everything, and they pick the date that's convenient for them. And then you're not doing the back and forth. And what usually happens is your link, I don't know if StreamYard will do it, but like Zoom, it'll send the link to the actual guest. So you don't
Oh,
have to
wow.
go back and forth.
I'm doing a lot of extra stuff.
Hmm.
How do you, I guess that's one of the differences between radio and podcasting is that you have a specific time and place where you show up. You have your radio show every day, and you have a producer or somebody on the other side of the mic that's working a bunch of things. Not always. Okay.
Not always. And
One off
here's the thing.
WKRP in Cincinnati.
Well, this is the thing. Okay, so when I got in radio, I started in radio in small town, and actually, it's funny you mentioned WKRP because I worked for Win 106 in Indiana, and actually, the sister station, which was an AM station, was WKRP. So there really is
Right.
a WKRP, except it is in North Vernon, Indiana, or at least it was. So when I started in radio, it basically was this. I had a friend, he wasn't a friend at the time, but I won a pizza off the radio. I became friends with one of the jocks. The jock basically said, "You got a great voice. Why don't you come hang out at the studio? I'm tired of programming the station. Will you come in?" "Oh, sure. Okay, fine." So, and this is very abnormal, folks. This did not normally happen. So I would pick all the songs. He taught me how to program the station. Now, this is 1993, where DJs used to be able to pick their own music, what they wanted to
Mm.
play. By the time I rolled into my next station, which would be Z100 in New Orleans, I'm I stood in front of a computer. I had to monitor the levels. I got to talk when the computer said to talk, basically, when the music. I did not get to pick any of the music I played, none of that. It was
Hmm.
all computerized. So radio changed a lot. And Matt, the gentleman that's on that Fast Susie podcast, used to be a program director. But my whole point about the radio, so when I started in radio, I interviewed on a Tuesday. Friday, I was on the air. I had no real training on how to do any of the levels or anything. I had a disc jockey sit with me for about maybe an hour, if that. And he looked at me and says, "Well, you're good at what you do." He's like, "I know people that went to school with this that can't do this, so I'm leaving. Bye." And he was supposed to be there all night with me, which was midnight to 4 at the time.
Hmm.
So it was one of those things where I lucked into being a disc jockey. And I watched how things have changed. It's not as
Nice.
glamorous as people think it is.
So so I guess podcasting now, you have much more freedom than you would if you were on the radio now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know how it works in bigger markets, but when I was in the bigger market, everything was done for me. And I mean, that kind of goes back to what you've heard about throughout the career of radio or history of radio of payola. You know, that your song gets on the radio because somebody's paying for it. And
Yeah.
so that kind of supports that. If it's all computerized, then what you're calling in to hear is not going to be played necessarily. It's in rotation.
When you were booking guests starting out, how'd you get them? That was my number one stress starting was consistency and making sure I was able to be consistent with someone to talk to every week. So
How when I first started out, I reached out to a couple of people I knew that that did interesting things. My friend Sarah was one of them. She's a medium. Another person I knew from Australia, she actually sees energy. So it was like, even though I was going with the better two topic, I reached out to them because I knew I could actually have interesting conversations about unexplainable things. And we could also talk about better two moments. So I reached out that way. And then I joined Matchmaker FM, not matchmaker.com, totally different things, folks. But
yeah.
um, yeah, you have to put that .fm, otherwise people look at you. Although I did get hit on there, so some people had the wrong idea. But anyway, the whole thing is you start building your audience that way, and it was pretty amazing because I think I was doing this for about 6 months, and I started having public relations agents reach out to me to work with them. And so you build a rapport working with the public relations agents, and they will start sending you people. And I still deal with people on Matchmaker, as you know, but
Yeah.
I also deal with public relations agents now, and that gives you it's a whole different ballgame when you start dealing with people that actually have talent agents.
How many people then do you have behind the scenes of your show right now?
Me.
Okay. All right.
And like until the end of season 2, it was just me doing everything. And then Rich, who was nice enough to loan me my mic and everything, Rich is like, why don't you have me doing your sound, your audio? And I'm like, because I don't want to bother you. He's like, no. I'm like, okay, fine. So he does the audio and then he sends it back to me and then I match it up with the video. So I have to go back and edit the video. And that's it. It's Rich and I. And Rich does the sound and I do all the rest.
Okay.
And that's why I took the hiatus because it was just a lot. So
How do you decide how long a season is?
I don't. I mean, honestly, season 7 should have been longer. Usually I was making them about 20 episodes. Season 7 only has 9 episodes because I realized I was hitting that 150 show and we were going into a new year. So I decided that what better way to start a new season and start the new year with all the changes in the podcast at episode 150. So usually I will go about 20 episodes. I thought of it kind of like a television series. You used to have 22 episodes in a season on a series. So
Mm-hmm.
I tried to do that. But overall, the episodes they usually are in the 20s. Sometimes there's a little more, sometimes there's less. So there's no consistency. But I mean, like I said, if I wouldn't have had the 150 episode, I would not have pushed so hard to say, okay, this is season 8. But I didn't want to drop 150 in the middle of a season,
Yeah.
especially
How
making
many?
changes. Sorry.
Yeah, I like the new song. I like your music from Fast
Fast.
Susie. That sounds good, and the quality of it, like the sound of it, is good, and the music is good. So I like that.
Well, Rich is producing that record, and I'm fortunate enough that Matt, the founder of Fast Susie, gave me the music for now without a licensing agreement. I don't have a licensing agreement at this point because he knows I am still not that big a name.
Yeah,
So it's a blessing that Matt and Rich got together to give me this. Rich is producing their record, so that's why the sound quality for the music is there too.
yeah, it sounds good. The I know a couple audio engineers, and to hear them talk about recording, I get lost in it in the conversation after a few minutes because they start talking about what they can hear and the levels of things, and like, man, I I like StreamYard because you can do video and audio and it's already together. And
Hmm.
I've had a few that they get off because of the connection somewhere. So the voice will be a little behind, like the sound will be a little behind the picture, but then it evens out. So it's
Oh, there's been times like I asked Rich. I said, "Do you want me to sing?" Because there's a total of 5 people on this last podcast. I'm like, "Do you want me to
mm,
send all the recordings separate?" Yep. And so it worked. He married it all together, and I didn't have problems. But there have been problems where he's cut out certain pieces of dialogue or something, where there's dead air or there's somebody just umming or whatever, and it messes with me with editing the video. So we've kind of come to an agreement that don't cut so much. I'll deal with it in post on my side. So
yeah.
yeah.
The when you're scheduling, do
Mhm.
you have a few shows that you've had recorded and ready to go, like waiting to get published, or are you every week you finish it and it gets published immediately?
Right now I have one in the can.
Okay.
Sometimes I have more, but right now I only have one. The holidays kind of put a kink in everything, but this month at this moment, I have 2 more to tape this month, and I think 3 pending. So I'll have that in a can, and especially because I'm going to be in the process of moving, I need those episodes in the can. And like I
Yeah.
said, I used to do a weekly podcast. Now mine is every other week because once again, it becomes a long process, a slog that you have to keep getting a new guest. You have to keep making sure everything is stacked up nicely. Where if you're doing everything, every other week, and if you decide to release an extra episode, then you release an extra episode. But if you're doing everything every other week, you have time to promote it. You have time for people to find it and listen to it. You have that extra little cushion where you're not pushing yourself so hard. I know people that only do podcasts once a month, and to me
Mm.
that's too much of a lag. Where at least twice a month, there's still you can keep listening. You can keep finding new stuff. You're not, you know.
Yeah, with the ones I listen to, of course, Joe Rogan, pretty popular. But there were times where he'd have more than a few days of not having anything out, and it drops off of your normal schedule of what you do. Like you find something else, and now you're listening to Adam Carolla instead of Joe Rogan, but now you have to fill them all in. And then doing this, I listen to a lot of podcasts from people I talk to. So now that stuff's all mixed in, and I find I watch a lot less TV because I'm listening to podcasts more. And that's, I like it because you can do other things while you're listening to the podcast. Like sometimes you get into one where you're like, I need to sit down and really listen to this. And if it's available on video, then I'll watch it on
Mm-hmm.
video as well. Like with yours, I would listen on Spotify. And then if I was like, I got to concentrate on this, I'd watch it on YouTube. And that's how a lot of the other ones go too. Like, I think Jocko Wilnick does one that I don't think on Spotify it's video, but on YouTube it is, something like that. So I get bummed out when I can't look at the video on Spotify because sometimes I am just listening to it and then they'll say, like this thing you see here, and I'll have to stop what I'm doing and then look at it and go, oh, okay, I can see it, or now I got to cross-reference that with another source and look it up. So I wonder how much of the market you capture determining how many different hosting things you do for a podcast. Do
I,
you go through a bunch of them, or how do you do it?
I haven't quite found the secret sauce, I would guess, for that. It's interesting because I've learned even from my own podcast. I'm not loyal to any one podcast. I'll admit that. So I don't sit there and I'm not a hardcore podcast listener. Maybe it's an occupational hazard. I don't know. But if there's something that I'm interested in, a topic that I'm interested in, or a guest that I'm interested in, then I will listen to that podcast. And I think that's the one thing as podcasters we don't necessarily think about unless you're and that's a the podcasting realm has changed even since I've gotten in. I've only been in it for 4 years now, but people have gotten to the point where it's like there's a lot of celebrities doing the podcast. So a celebrity, they're going to be more interested in what that celebrity has to say than what you or I have to say. So we're competing with the bigger names that have the bigger budget, that have the ability to have somebody market it for them. But part of it also is if you get a good guest on that has had experience. I mean, like, okay, so Matt had that song, the guy from Fast Susie. He worked with the REO tribute band. Okay, so I can tag REO in there. He wrote a song for Ronnie James Dio. Okay, so because that's a topic of conversation, I can tag that in my pot. I can tag that. So depending on what you're talking about, you can use those hashtags to try to promote because that is part of the conversation. Like when
Mm-hmm.
I had Merchant on, I had Merchant is he's a producer mainly. He did a solo record, and I had him twice on my show, and he worked with Duran Duran's John Taylor. So we talked about that. We talked about how that experience was. We covered all those things, and yes, I tagged all the people and everything that I needed to do. Well, when I re-released his, because he's the top third episode of my podcast, when I re-released it, I made sure that I tagged people. But then again, now he's a songwriter on 30 Seconds to Mars' latest single that's climbing the charts. So I put a little buzz in there that yes, he's a songwriter on this thing, and he's got his first top 25 hit because he's been talking about that. So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to tag that. So it's like you have to find a way to promote it. And for me, unfortunately, I don't have the means to pay for advertising, to do Facebook ads or Instagram ads. I don't have the means to do that. I think that's if you have the means to be able to advertise on your social media, you get more followers. But if you don't, you're competing against the algorithm, and that's the hardest thing. And TikTok is notorious for quashing you. You can hit
Oh,
one day if they change the algorithm. I think one day I did something and I had like 2,000 hits on a video. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. And then they changed the algorithm again and I went down to 200 and something. But the interesting thing is during the holidays, and I did some research on this, during the holidays, my views went down to 30. And I'm like, why is that? And what the research told me was that during the holiday season, you have all these bigger corporations paying for the ad space. So your TikTok feed is getting inundated with ads. And so the normal creators that people look at aren't going to be there because they're getting these ads in their things. So therefore, you're not being seen.
yeah.
And that's the one thing I don't think anybody really realizes that you're constantly competing against an algorithm that is forever changing. I can tell you that, yes, this is going to work, but ultimately, is it going to work? Because the algorithm changed again.
Yeah, I can. Sometimes I look at on YouTube and X are two that are easy for me to look at how the statistics are going for clips or the shows. And I'm sure you could do it on Instagram, but I just haven't gone through the method of how to how to easily look it up yet. But I can see when the algorithm picks it up because you'll have a thing that's like 10 or 20 views, and then the next time it's 300. And
Mm.
you're like, whoa, okay, that's got something happened there. I haven't had any where it's thousands or millions, but I kind of see the podcasting, this type of podcasting is like a garage band where you make an album, it's in a local record store, and somebody's going to find it just because they're going through the stacks, not because you're out there advertising it on anything like the CD clearinghouses back in the
Well,
day.
that's like so working with the PR agents. That's I work with a lot of up and coming on my as far as guests. I've had a lot of up and coming country artists, and I even had Ricky Duran from The Voice on the show. So the thing is, when you get guests of that nature, you think that's going to lift you up, but it moves you a little bit off the needle. The thing
Hmm.
about that though is like some of these artists that are coming up, you never know who you might interview that might actually blow up. And if they blow up, that interview you did could very well blow up. But once again, we're talking about one interview. And
Mhm.
they're looking for that person. They're not looking for you. So you still have to make sure you represent yourself right, and you may get followers out of that, but you can't go into an interview expecting that, oh, look who I'm interviewing. This is going to be the biggest deal yet. I'm going to make my mark, because the sheer fact is they're tuning in to hear the person.
Yeah.
You're just the means of delivering the interview.
Yeah. It's about the topic is always a thing that's in
Mhm.
my head when I'm talking on this,
Mhm.
but it also is something that if I'm interested in the topic, then that's easy to talk about. So
Mhm.
I try to either ask people to be on that I am interested in, or if people find out through Matchmaker FM, if they send a message and say, like to be on your show, this is what I do, then I look at that stuff and say, oh, well, I, this is interesting what you're doing. I'm interested in this part of it. We could talk about all of it, but mainly my questions are probably going to be about this. Is that something you want to talk about? And I have I have maybe on matchmaker.fm about 50% success rate of people that I ask that actually say yes. And every now and then you'll get somebody that cancels at the last minute, and that stinks. But especially if you're trying to be consistent with having at least a show a week and you don't have any in reserve to put on. But it's the advertising and in that end of things, I haven't explored as much as I have with the idea of just looking at topics I'm interested in and seeking those people out to talk about different things. So
Well,
I don't see getting wildly popular, but you never know.
well,
At least you're having a good time while you're doing it.
well, that's it. As long as you have a good time doing it, then that's half the battle. It's when I felt myself because yeah, I got to a point where I was taking guests that I necessarily I wasn't happy with.
Hmm.
But I needed that show, so I wanted to get that interview out. So I'm just gonna take whatever. And I look back at some of the shows, and it's like that could have been better. I could have had a different guest. That could have been better. And so as long as you're enjoying the podcast, it's like same thing as with writing. When people talk about wanting to be a writer, it's like, yeah, being a writer is great. And sure, you can publish your book and you can put it out there, and that is wonderful too. But you have to write because you enjoy it. Don't write because you think you're going to be the next big seller. I'm not telling you that you won't become the next bestseller, because you might. But if you're not enjoying writing, then people are going to recognize that. And it's the same thing with podcasting. If you don't enjoy it, then don't do it. If you find it's a grind, don't do it.
Yeah, I do find maybe 3 times or so I've asked myself, why am I doing this? And and then I remember, oh, it's because I like talking to creative people, and this is what I'm doing. I'm talking to creative people. It just has this other element of where you're recording it and then putting it out there for other people to listen to so they can be in a conversation talking about creativity. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what keeps me going on this. And then finding those, getting the learning curve done to where you can say, I can now comfortably do this many recordings in this amount of time, and I'm not stressed about the consistency of it. And I'm not really stressed about advertising because my expectation, I want to do right by the person that's on here. I don't want to waste people's time. So that's why it's a thing where they can use as many clips as they want. So if they want to do advertising for themselves, that's fine too. But they don't have to do advertising for this show. But I think you talked earlier about the repetition of it to where you get to the point of you just feel like every show is the same and that you're asking either the same questions or going through the same motions of it. But also, I think it's that part of you might have somebody watch just one show. So they don't know all those other things. They haven't been bored by watching every show, hearing you ask kind of the same question to a bunch of different people. So I try
Well,
to personalize each one that way.
that's the one thing. I mean, the only time I really wish I would have had a script is I interviewed somebody that has autism. And I have always prided myself on, I usually will have a sheet of information for me in case I need something, but most of the time I don't. But I wish I would have had a sheet of questions for him because it would have made the interview easier for him. But I've had people I've met on Instagram that I ended up interviewing, and one of them was an Australian male model that won a massive contest and then became an actor. And the interesting thing about that is, so all I had, a friend put us together. All I had was his name. And so this required me to do a deep dive on him. So I had like 2.5 pages of information about things he had done and everything else. And him and there was another male model, same thing. I did a deep dive. And they both just said, "How do you know all this?" And I'm like, "It's the internet. I did my research." And that's the thing. A lot of the times when you're dealing with PR people or whatever, they give you everything. When you have a guest that all you really have is a name and you know that this will be a decent interview, you have to
Mm-hmm.
do your work. And even people on Matchmaker, I would still go through and dig up information and find out what I need to find out because you're gonna make the interview different. As you were saying, you're tailoring it to the guest and also to making it something special. I mean, when I went to the Vampires Convention because I wanted to give Joseph Morgan a copy of my book, and Joseph Morgan he played Klaus Michelson in the originals for those who don't know. So I knew I was going, and I knew that all the fangirls there were going to have their Vampire Diaries or originals memorabilia to have him sign and whatnot. So I went through his Internet Movie Database and I found a movie that was not really talked about, and I ordered a copy of the DVD. And I watched it because just in case, just in
Yeah.
case there was a question about the movie, so I watched it. And so I'm in line, and yes, everybody's got their little vampire stuff. And I laid laid the DVD down on the table, and he looks at me and goes, "Yeah, this is a bad movie." He says it, just, "It's a bad movie." And I'm like, mm. And then he tells me a story about how he couldn't understand why on the cover of the DVD and on the movie poster, they had him with a gun. Because he never had a gun in the movie at all. So he gave me this whole conversation about this, and we talked a little bit, and I gave him the book. But the whole fact of the matter is, because I did that differently, it stood out. And so if you're tailoring your interview, if you have the nitty gritty where you can make that interview just slightly different than the normal questions, it's important. And I mean, don't we do that in a normal conversation? We end up coming up with things that you don't even know where it came from. You just blurt it out because that's what you're talking about. It's a different view on that subject.
Yeah, I found that it was more of a stumbling block to have set questions where you're just going down the questions because now you're maybe not paying attention to the conversation because you ask the question, they start talking, and now you're over here looking at the next question to see what you're going to talk about next instead of trying to make the conversation flow naturally. The one part, the negative of that, I think you've talked about earlier, was somebody will say something, and because we're in this format where one person talks and then the other person does, because you're not in the same room, it's a different conversation than if you're sitting in the same room with someone, that they're going to say something and you're like, if they were here, I would ask about that immediately, but we're going to go on with the rest of it. So usually I write stuff down
Mm-hmm.
to talk to or to go back to, but sometimes it comes back up in the conversation just because it does. And then other times at the end, I'll go through and go, okay, I'd like to know about this, this, and this, because I didn't get a chance to talk about it before. But
That's the importance of keeping that pencil or pen right there in that sheet of paper, because there's going to be something that somebody says. I mean, going back to that Fast Susie interview, Matt had worked with the REO tribute band, and the first time out, he's like, "Yeah, I really wanted to leave it." And he was the way he worded it. The first thing that pops in my head is, "I can't fight this feeling," and so I missed my opportunity to butt in and say it. And by the second time, I'm just like, "No, I'm going for it," because it was just there. And granted, I was being funny, but the whole fact is, you have to make it entertaining, even if it's the most ridiculous thing in the world. You still, I mean, it fits so well. You wanted to leave the band. Well, you couldn't fight
yeah,
the feeling, I guess. And you know, you have to find moments to make that podcast your own, because that's, if you can find humor even in the strangest places at times, as long as it's appropriate. You know, if somebody's pouring their heart out about their loss of their family member or something else, then you don't want to make it funny. But in that
yeah,
situation, it was fine.
yeah. It's you hear sportscasters sometime. I remember them telling stories about they would be calling a game and they'd have bets on if they could work in a certain phrase to whatever when they were calling the game. So that's interesting to think you say something that the person you're talking to, it just sounds like regular words, but somewhere someone else is like, yes, you got that in, or
Mm-hmm.
it's that engagement there. And then oftentimes with podcasts, you're talking to a person that's a stranger. And while
Right.
it's a little different than a total stranger because you've been able to look on the internet, look at past stuff they've done, listen to podcasts they've done. So in essence, you do know them a little because you know their feelings about some things or stuff they've done, interviews they've done in the past or conversations they've had in the past. So you're not coming into it completely cold, but it is a different dynamic than talking to just someone you've never met before versus talking to someone on a podcast that you've never met before but researched versus someone that any of that, but they're in the same room as you. And it's different. I wonder, there's got to be a book about that. It's probably a psychology book, but
Oh, I'm sure. I'm
what,
sure. Yes.
see, this would be that part where in post they would cut out that pause, but I
Yeah.
like the pause. I like the pause. It's just normal because now I'm looking at all these other things that I've written down and I'm like, yeah, I do want to ask about that. But then in the part of the conversation, you've written down a couple words and you can't remember exactly what you meant by whatever question you're doing. So then you have to make a note to yourself later, write that out as a question next time so you can remember it while you're talking to a person. These are things you don't do when you're talking to somebody in person, like
Mm.
in the same room.
No, but that's part of being an interviewer. It's part of that skill of learning how to interview, and having to being able to jump from conversation point to conversation point and then back again. It's not always an easy task, but it's something that you have to focus on when you're doing it, because while you're listening, while you're actively listening, I mean, us as humans do it in a normal conversation. While we're actively listening, our mind is still processing, going, well, wait a second, I can relate to that because I can do this here. But it's just a normal process. And that's the thing about the conversationalist podcast. It's gonna be that flow of words, flow of energy. Because if you're riffing off of each other, then it works. And if you're not riffing, you can tell when a podcast is not working. Because there was one podcast I did where a lady was trying to promote her book. And so I would ask her a question about something that was based in her book because it was based on her life. And she just kept saying to me, "It's in the book." And I thought to myself, why did you decide to sign up for a podcast if you're just going to sit here and tell me it's in the book?
Yeah.
Because we want to know your story. We want to know at least a little bit about it to get us interested in the book. If you're just going to stonewall me and tell me it's in the book, I'm not going to really be willing to read the book, because you're not making me, and you're not enticing me to read.
Yeah. Let me know what kind of person you are through conversation, and then I'll decide if that's the type of person I want to read a book about.
Right. If I have this inspiring conversation with you, inspiring conversation, then I'm definitely going to want to read more about what happened then. But if you're going to just tell me it's in the book,
Yeah, it doesn't even need to be exactly the topic of the book. If you have a conversation with somebody and you're like, wow, that's a good conversation, or it's a podcast you listen to and you think, I felt like I was in the room, I related to the conversation, it flowed well, it was a good talk. Let me check the book out. It might be a
mhm.
totally different topic, but let me check that out.
I mean, the interesting thing I would say about podcasting is I have had the pleasure of talking to people that I would never have imagined to be able to talk to. I talked to a neuroscientist in Japan. I mean, he reached out to talk to me, and I was just kind of like, "You want to be on my show?" Um, but I talked to the gentleman who landed his gyrocopter on Capitol Hill and his whole experience. And that was, we did a 2 hour podcast. And then after we signed off, we still had another 2 hour conversation.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of amazing people that I've gotten to talk to through this. And I know that there'll be more amazing people to come. It's just, I need to pace myself. And that's where I'm at now. It's like you have to pace yourself. You can't do it constantly.
Hmm.
Unless I'm getting paid, and that's at a certain point when you're doing the one woman show, it's a little hard to do everything all the
Yeah, if
time.
you just had to walk in and
Yeah,
they're like, here's who you're talking to, or
yeah,
I would imagine on those big shows you get to pick who you're going to talk to, and maybe sometimes they'll say we want you to talk to this person, and you go, okay, I'll talk to this person, but this is also somebody I want to talk to.
hmm,
It's those conversations after their recordings are off are interesting. They could be a whole nother episode of a podcast,
yeah,
but you're not going to get the same thing when it's recorded.
no,
When for some reason when the recording stops, people aren't totally different, they're just more relaxed.
hmm,
So it there are many times so far that we've stopped the podcast and we're talking after, and I'm like, man, this is great stuff. This is great stuff, purely from an just a not from a marketing standpoint, but just from this conversation, this part of it could be more interesting than what we recorded.
I get that. I do get that. Trust me.
Yeah. So then, how about we talk about writing for a little
Okay,
while?
all right, I'm game.
So I feel like you would describe yourself as a writer before anything else currently.
At this time
Is
in my
that true?
life, yes, yes, I've been writing. I started writing fan fiction in high school with one of my friends. I mean, I always would. Being a child from divorce, back in the 70s, I would tend to create stories in my head. I would insert myself into TV shows. Suddenly, Heart to Heart, they had a kid, and I was that kid. Even though they had no kid, I was suddenly that kid, and I ran with that. So I would always create these stories in my head. And in high school, one of my friends, she liked a couple of bands, and she's like, "Hey, I'm writing a story," and she threw me in there, and I'm like, "Well, wait a second, I can write my own story." So I wrote a couple of things with different friends through the years, and then around 1989, I just basically started writing along for myself. And then, so I had this 30-year novel. This is the best way to describe this as my writing journey. I have a 30-year novel that I'm on my second marriage. My husband is being put in dialysis, and I'm stuck at Barnes and Noble because I don't want to drive all the way back home to go pick him up again. And he's at dialysis for like 5 hours. So I I sit in Barnes and Noble and I start working on the 30-year novel, and I start tinkering with the idea because one of my characters basically has come to me and says, "I got an idea for you. Great marketing idea. Perfect marketing idea." Okay, I'm like, "All right, fine." And it's this guy's tale about his addiction. So I start a daily blog for this guy who is a cokehead. He is a cokehead. He is an alcoholic. He is just a rock star who is out of control. He is not, as one of my readers put, because this ends up turning into a book, but as one of my readers said about him, the very first review I ever got about this book was, "He is the vilest human you will ever meet." So,
It's
so
good
I
to have emotion.
exactly. So I start this blog, and I start having rehab centers follow me. And we picked my husband up. I'm like, "Yeah, such and such rehab followed me today," and I just couldn't help but laugh because I'm like, "Are you guys thinking this is real?" Because if you're really believing this is real, this is ridiculous. Because he's over the top. And so, yeah, they kept following, they kept liking the post. I'm like, I think I was on day 70, and I'm like, all right, I should turn this into a book itself. So I decide I'm going to turn it into a book, and I have the ending all picked out, and I know people are going to be like, she hears voices. So I'm going to dialysis. I'm taking my husband to dialysis, and the guy in the book comes to me, and he's like, I got a better ending for you. In fact, the ending will set up a whole series for you. You can take that 30-year novel and you can make something with it. And I'm like, yeah, right. I wrote it. I changed the ending on the book, and yeah, here we are. But I also, at the time, Barnes and Noble was closing. So since Barnes and Noble was closing, my friend that worked there, she's like, we're having new authors night. It'll be the last new authors night ever there. So it wasn't just me signing, it was like 12 other authors, but I had my first signing at Barnes and Noble. So I rushed to get the book finished. It was not edited properly, I admit that, but it was a journal, so why should it be edited? That was my naivety.
Nice.
And I did the cover and everything, and I got it out. And then a month and a half later, somebody sent me this thing, or a month later, somebody sent me this thing that publishing house was looking for. They had an open call. This was 2019. And so I wrote a novel in a month and a half. The first book, Days, took me from 2017 to 2019, so roughly a year and a half to 2 years. This took, in a month and a half, I wrote this book. It wasn't even a month and a half because I started with a different topic. So a month I wrote this book. I get to the point where there's a contract. You know, when you submit, there's a contract. And there's a line in the submission that says, if we happen to write a book, and it's not exactly worded this way, it's more legalese, but the dumbing down of it was, if we happen to write another book or publish another book that is just like yours, you can't sue us. And I just said, no. So I kept my book, and I put some characters in it from the first book, and I released that in November. And then it took 4 years to write, which I have stuff. I have 5 books out now. I'm working on book 6. I have books for stuff for books 7, 8, and 9 written. And this is why I was able to put 3 books out last year, is because for 2 years or 4 years, I sat there and wrote. Just different scenes at different times whenever it came to me, and then filled in the blanks. So
Nice. It's nice to hear that part of the process where you're not writing it linearly, where you're doing this scene, and then how do you go about putting them in order and deciding, how do you decide your order for your scenes after you get them done?
okay, so like the 30-year novel, here we go. Because everybody's like, well, what happened with this 30-year novel? So like when I did the second book, I ended up taking scenes from that first book and put it into the second book. That's another reason why I was able to finish it so quickly. But it wasn't like I took the whole book. I took a scene that was just itching to be used and moved it over. So do I plot? I create an outline. I create a lovely outline. I have several outlines, but the characters tend to, just like at the very end of that last book, that first book, the characters will tend to drag me along and go somewhere else. And even though, like with this book that I'm working on right now, I have the scene written. I had this whole beginning section written, and my characters are like, no, I don't want it to go this way. You need to write it a little differently. So I tend to go along the lines of what they're saying. And that may seem crazy to some people, but I do intuit. I do intuitive work. I am an intuitive reader as well. That's one of my other skills. And so I think when I look at Days, the first book, I wrote it like a guy. There's men that have read it that swore a guy wrote it. And I look at it because I wrote it in Barnes and at the Toyota dealership when my car was getting worked on. And there's stuff, I mean, my husband would literally say, I live vicariously through him. Because there's no way I could write half the stuff I wrote. So I felt like I intuited a lot of that stuff. That it just flowed through me. Because when it flows easily.
Yeah. That's
So,
the great part of writing that I found, is when you, even if it's not what you thought, and sometimes it's better when it's not what you thought, that it starts to feel like it's writing itself. And when the characters they develop that personality, in your head at least, to where you're like, oh, this is where I thought the story was going to go, but this isn't what they would do.
Well, I mean,
And
go ahead.
I think that's probably developing that empathy muscle that you develop for your whole life, of trying to look at something from someone else's perspective, not sympathy, but empathy. And do you find that is true with your characters, that
Yes.
you, okay.
No, I mean, I didn't mean to, to blurt it out. Yeah, because I mean, when I look at my characters, the main guy, I can sit here and say that people are like, well, who is he? And the fact of the matter is, the more, because I've reread the book a couple of times, because as an author, you sometimes go back to the original text to make sure, especially in the situation of how my series is written, it's not written like a normal series. I go back to make sure I'm doing him justice. Now, while he may look like a certain rock star, his mannerisms and stuff came from two different actors that I knew. But ultimately, some of his personality, I realized as I reread this that it was my father. My dad was not addicted to coke, folks. He did have a drinking problem, but the fact of the matter is, there are people in your life that you become em- empathetic to because you watch them, you learn from them, you see how they are, and that translates. Even if it's not the nicest version, it still translates into a character, because this is what you saw, this is how you experience it, this is what you can empathize for the person because you understand what they're doing in a different manner because you watched it.
Yeah, empathy is a strange thing. For a while in life, I'm not sure how many years ago I would have said it peaked in this idea. Oftentimes you get an interview question, like a job interview question, of what's your greatest weakness. And I thought about that a lot. And I think empathy is probably a great strength, but could be a great weakness too. Like if I was in a job interview and somebody said, what's your greatest weakness? Now I would say spelling. And this is what I'm doing to address it. But I wouldn't go, I'm not in therapy when I'm talking to an interviewer for a job. But just thinking about it on my own, I think empathy is a huge thing, especially for writers, because you have to be able to understand why you feel what you feel and why other people would feel what they feel, and how that interacts with each other. So you can read people or talk to people and not agree with them, but still understand them. And everybody doesn't have to think alike. If we all thought alike, that would be terrible. So the I think a great weakness could be an overdeveloped sense of empathy, not like in The Princess Bride, an overly developed sense of vengeance. Okay, that's a good line. But you could get to the point where you're so lost in trying to think what other people think that then you lose what you're thinking yourself. So it definitely have to be empathetic, but not overly empathetic. And I think that helps in writing and then just in normal living too. I'm not
Well,
sure how I got on this topic, but
no, but I mean, I get it, because the fact of the matter is, right now, and I don't want to necessarily go with society in general, but society wants us to conform so much to certain people's, everybody's wants to, there's certain people that want us to have certain viewpoints, and it's like, this is where we have such a pushback, because we can't all be empathetic, but we can offer sympathy. There's your thing, but we have to be able to accept who we are as individuals, and I think that is the biggest lesson, that is for all of us, is because we're not taught to be individuals. As soon as we start school, we are not taught to be individuals. As soon as, we are taught that you have to learn this way, you have to study this way. And now we're seeing evidence that we don't all learn the same. We don't all, we're not wired the same. And I think that's the biggest problem. That's why when I'm sitting here saying, in general, when somebody sits there and says, well, I hear voices, I don't really hear voices. But I mean, there's so many things that I have experienced that I can't explain. And it doesn't make me, I mean, it doesn't make me crazy. And that's a bad word now too. But like when my stepmom died, and this is going to be off the topic, but it's still kind of relevant, because when my stepmother died, I had been focused about Hurricane Katrina coming. My husband had was in the hospital for a stent, and I talked to my stepmom that week, And she told me, this was like 4 days before this. She's like, you need to make sure that you have life insurance coverage. Okay. And I mean, I knew John had life insurance, so it's no problem. But she's adamant that I got to make sure of this. Okay, fine. So John gets out the hospital Saturday. I find out Katrina's happening because I have family down in New Orleans. I was not aware how in the world, but I was focused on him. This was like his first time in the hospital. So I call my grandma. I call, find out my grandmother's been evacuated. I talk to my dad. He's in the car. He's like, "Yeah, we're going to Tunica. Everything's fine." Okay, fine. I wake up in the middle of the night, look at my husband, and say, "I can't breathe." He's like, "What'd you say?" I'm like, "I don't know. Don't know." Got up, played a video game, went back to bed about 3 in the morning. Get a phone call at 6 from my dad. He says my stepmom's dead.
Hmm.
I'm like, "Okay." So when I asked my dad a year later, I'm like, "What exactly happened?" He's like, "Well, we went to bed. And Cindy woke me up and she said, 'Donnie, I can't breathe.'" Okay. How do you
Hmm.
explain that? I'm up here in Illinois. She's in Tunica, Mississippi. You can't.
Yeah, there's more connections than we realize.
Right. And I mean, the fact that she's telling me so adamantly about life insurance 4 days before, which, by the way, my dad contends that she didn't have any. I don't know that that's true or not. But, you know, the whole fact of the matter is, it was almost like foreshadowing that conversation with her. And then to experience that was just bizarre as anything. But that's the thing. There's so many things in life that we can't explain. And so when a writer talks about having characters coming to them and speaking to them, or you getting that sense of knowing before something happens, even with your not being a writer, you have to trust that. You have to understand that.
Where do you think then? This is a thing I think about a lot. Where do you think that ideas come from?
Well, we're going to go back to my neuroscience scientist podcast. And I mean, I'm also a teacher, and like I said, I do readings. So the neuroscientist told me for a sheer fact, so this is scientific, that we
Okay.
are all connected. We are all connected. That basically there is a stream that runs through all of us, and that we are all connected in different ways. And so it goes also back to, for every action, there's a reaction. And there was an incident where I dropped something. We were moving out of the other house. I dropped something, glass shattered, and my husband's like, "Just leave it." I'm like, "No, there's kids around. We can't do that." So I picked up the glass, and because the kids always hung out on our stoop for some reason. So we end up, because of this delay, we end up in front of this college um, at a certain time. So as we're getting closer to the college, the light is turning yellow. I hit my brakes. This guy rear ends me. Now, he was doing about 60. We had a RAV. He hit the tire. We got injured, but not as bad, because if we would not have been there, he would have went through that intersection and T-boned a teenager. So for every action, there's a reaction. Had I not dropped that glass, we wouldn't have been delayed, and we wouldn't have been in that intersection.
That now, from now on, if I break something, I'm going to stop and go, why
I
did this
mean,
happen?
I mean, the fact is, every delay that we get mad about, there's usually something behind us, possibly protecting us, and we don't even realize it. We're just annoyed as anything.
I have thought about that numerous occasions, especially out driving, where you say, I didn't make this light, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's going to keep me from getting into a crash down the road somewhere. Kind of same idea as in Back to the Future, where he doesn't do the race when the guy calls him. I don't know if he calls him scared or yellow, or I might be conflating Western with somebody getting called yellow. Anyway, tells him that he's not willing to race him, and then he goes backwards instead of forward, and then the car goes through the intersection. And he goes, I would have run into that car if I had erased him. If I'd
Mm-hmm.
erased him.
Uh, there,
So
there's a one day, because yes, I'm Gen X. We were coming home from somewhere, and somebody had a Barbie dream house. And yes, this is way before the Barbie movie came out. This was like the old-fashioned 1970s Barbie dream house, and it was out in their front yard for trash. And we were stopped at a stoplight, and I looked at my husband. I'm like, I always wanted one of those when I was a kid. That was the one toy I didn't get that I wanted. It had the elevator and all.
mm-hmm.
Just as I turn around and look, the light has turned green, and this 18 wheeler comes barreling through an intersection where he's supposed to be doing 35, is doing about 55, and he blows the light. And I used to joke that this Barbie dream house saved our life
Saved
because
by
we would have
Barbie.
been right in the intersection. So, you know,
Did you get the Barbie dream house?
no, I did not. No, I did not. I did not trash pick it. I didn't have a reason to. I mean, even though I wanted it, there was no. What was I going to do? It was on a busy street, so I was like, yeah, if it would have been maybe a smaller street, I might have done it, but yeah.
I mean, I feel like if Castle Grayskull was out there, I might have gone to take a closer look. I question your loyalty to Barbie now, but okay.
I have a whole Barbie collection, so yeah, no, which I will be getting rid of, but yeah, I have a whole Barbie collection.
With
So
the neuroscientist, where he or she, is it a
he,
he, where he says everybody is connected somehow. What do you think he meant by that, or did he explain
that
what that meant?
we have a stream of consciousness that runs through all of us, that all
Okay.
of us, how do you know, and I mean I've experienced this and I know everybody has, how do you know that something, when how do you know when somebody's going to call you? You have, sometimes there's those people in your life that you know exactly when they're going to call, and sure enough you're thinking of them and boom, they call. That is usually a connection, that is usually some kind of bound contract. I mean, you know what song's going to play on the radio because you thought about it and boom, and there it is. And that's the thing, you have to look at all these other little moving pieces. And here's the thing, the universe is great about, we get in our own way. We will sit there and say we don't want to do something. We're not going to do this. And a prime example is 2 years ago, my friend messages me and she's like, yeah, my friend's got this shop. She's having this event. You should go, you should sign up for it. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, whatever. And so about a week and a half later, she's like, you should sign up for this event. I'm like, yeah, yeah, whatever, no. And so she pushed one last time. I ended up signing up for it. Then she went out of town. And because I hadn't really done any events since then, since the pandemic, I was just kind of like, I'm not gonna do this, and I made up this excuse for not doing it. And the shop owner reached out, and she's like, "Oh no, you can do it still. Don't worry about it." Okay, so I did, and I ended up becoming a teacher at this shop. I ended up becoming friends with the owner, and it really opened a lot of doors for me. But that was my resistance in the universe. Sometimes we get in our own way, and the universe will keep pushing you, or God, however you want to refer to it. It will keep
Hmm.
pushing you until you do what you're supposed to do.
That's something. Especially when you think about how fungus is. I think that's what they call the largest living organism on Earth is a fungus somewhere in. For some reason, I'm picturing it in the upper left of the United States somewhere, and I think there's a forest that's like that too. But this fungus is in a forest because it's a mushroom that eats the certain type of wood that's in this forest. But it it spans across, I think, a state. I'm not
Oh,
sure. Somebody can look that up online. If I had some help here, they would look it up.
yeah,
Like Jamie on Joe Rogan, and they'd be able to pop it up. But you can look at it yourself. But the idea is that if something happens on one end of this fungus that's in this state, then the other end knows it instantly, and because they're connected through all this
right.
little this network that is through all the dirt that's out there everywhere. There's so much fungus in the dirt, and that fungus is more closely related to humans than we are to plants. I think that's how it goes. That fungus is more closely related to humans. So hearing a neuroscientist talk about that, that's I'm gonna have to check that episode out
It was. It's.
because
Go ahead.
it's kind of like everybody's connected with a sort of larger spanning Bluetooth where you're just
Exactly.
connected.
And I mean that's the thing. It's like there's there's a great book. It's called The Celestine Prophecy, and it talks about there's no coincidence. And that's the thing. If you look, I'm very good at looking at my life and seeing the connections because I look at my life. My stepfather wasn't the greatest stepfather in the world, but yet at 20, or actually I was 21, 22. At that age, I became a stepmother, and because of the step parent I had, I was aware of how to be a better step parent. And everything in my life I look as soliloquy at the lessons, because it's like you're presented with something and you had to go through this. I often laugh because my husband, and it sounds bad because I said laugh, but my husband that passed, when I look at my ex-husband, he's going through the same kind of health issues. So it's like whether I stayed with him or married my second husband, I would have ended up dealing with that same those same health issues and those same life lessons in my spouse.
Hmm.
So
It's
I
kind
find, go ahead.
it's kind of like if life is a simulation,
Hmm.
then before we entered into the simulation, we picked out these certain things, or there's a certain checklist of stuff that we have to go through or learn in this existence. And that's the
Depending
point of it.
depending on what universal laws or metaphysical laws you want to look at, they allege that we pick our parents and we do pick our choices that we're the lessons we're going to learn. And the one movie that blew my mind the first time I watched it was The Matrix. Because what if this is all a simulation? What if none of this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
real? And
I
I mean,
have
I know
some
that sounds outlandish, but
I have some poetry about reality that talks about simulations and things, but my thoughts after thinking about it a lot are, even if it is a simulation, it doesn't matter. I don't think you're going to be able to change much of what's going on just by understanding it's a simulation. But maybe it's a simulation, and that's just what some people aren't comfortable calling it that, but that's what it is, and that's what we understand it as, because it explains so much. Like, it's intelligent design. If you want to say everything happens for a reason, and something is pulling the strings, or there's destiny out there or whatever, that if you're in a simulation, that can be true. That
mhm,
that it explains God and all those things. The creator of the universe, yeah, that's who made the simulation. It's just the different words for explaining what I learned as a kid growing up in the church versus what I learned after watching The Matrix and all that stuff in between and after. The Matrix is, am I really like that trilogy. And there's that book that came out, I can't remember how long ago it was, but it's like a splinter in your mind, that talks about the philosophy behind the Matrix. Now, reading the book, I feel like it's probably twice as long as it needs to be. It's not that long of a book because it does repeat, but it what a good read that is. And then there's two YouTube videos. I think it was by Film Theory, about Neo is not the one and there is no escaping the Matrix. Those are the two titles that are kind of like it. They're maybe 15 minutes each, but for a while after the Matrix came out, I always was like, man, it doesn't, the way it ends is unsettling to me. It's like if certain things happen, then it would be the best science fiction trilogy, or just three movie thing of anything that I can in my lifetime. And then after I saw those two videos, I had resolved myself to thinking that Neo wasn't the one, and that they were always in the Matrix. They never escaped it. Even when they thought they were out of the Matrix, they were never in the Matrix. Because, is spoiler, because they're in that second movie when they're outside of the Matrix and he affects the Sentinel. And you're like, okay, that's clear to me that the writers and directors and people of that movie are saying, hey, they're always in the Matrix. And then this film theory thing, which I think is worth your time if you like the Matrix. Two good videos to watch on YouTube. Neo is not the one, and there's no escaping the Matrix. It's If you like the Matrix and you look at those things after that, you're going to be like, yes, it is the best. It is
but
the best.
did you watch the most recent Matrix movie?
I did. I don't remember much of it. So,
It was not as memorable. And the funny thing is, when you were talking about, one thing I remember as a kid playing with my Barbies, here we go again, was I always thought we were God's Barbie, God we were God's Barbie dolls. And I mean, in a way, that's a very dumbed down version, a kid's version of the simulation argument, because
Yeah.
somebody was pulling our strings in my mind. Because I'm pulling Barbie strings, obviously somebody's doing it with us. But there's a certain point where you have to question is what. I mean, I do believe that there's destiny. There's certain things that are destined in our lives. I do not disagree with that, but I also know that we do have some free will. And those choices, a great example of that is, yes, I'm a reader and I would get my cards read. And I had this one woman tell me I was going to meet this guy. I kept having these people tell me I was going to meet this guy, and didn't meet this guy. And so I was taking a class for intuition, and the teacher's like, you need to take this astrology class. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm just thinking she's like, no, there's a woman you have to meet in that class. I'm like, okay, fine. So I took the class, I met the woman. The woman introduces me to her ex boyfriend, who's just a friend that broke up a long time ago. And this will end up being my future husband. Okay?
Oh, this
Now,
is husband John then?
this is husband John, yes. So
Okay.
then if we go back, John and I start talking and everything, and it turns out that during that time when I kept getting told that I was going to meet this guy, he was working right down the street from me. Because I had to go pick him up one day from work, and I'm like, I used to work right down the block from you. And we used to go to the same restaurants. And then when we started really talking, it's like, oh, so my landlord was your ex boss at Wendy's, and we both worked at Chuck E. Cheese, even though I was in Louisiana and he was up here, and we both had
Hmm.
the same high school colors, and just on and on these little similarities. But my point is, because I wasn't looking at the time back in 97, he was there in front of me. I just didn't see it. So
Hmm.
sometimes, because of our own free will and not paying attention, we miss what we need to see.
Yeah. Then when you get into the multiverse idea of are all the different possibilities and scenarios playing out somewhere else, and we're just a little divergent from here, a little divergent from here, and this is just what we're aware of right now. But then you get into the idea of time being a disc, and that's it's going to blow my mind. But
Yeah.
it's getting in your thing where you talked about there's no coincidences. That makes a lot of sense. I do think that, and especially back when I was doing policing, that was when you're investigating something, that's what you always have to keep in mind is, okay, it's every now and then I would let one thing go in an investigation. You go, okay, maybe that just happened that way. And then after you get two or three of those, you're like, okay, it's more than just happened that way. For some reason, this is what I'm seeing, whether it's me being guided to see it or circumstances just putting me in the right place at the right time for some reason. Then you gotta look into those things, check those leads. So
Hmm.
yeah, no
Yeah.
coincidences.
No, I think we have to pay attention more. And when somebody is presented in our life, and if they, I mean, this is the other thing to think about. When somebody is presented into your life and you feel a pit in your stomach, or your stomach knots, or the hair on the back of your neck stands up, and you got a bad feeling, trust that feeling. Don't sit there. And I mean, sometimes that happens because the person is similar to somebody else from our past, but you really need to trust that feeling, trust that gut feeling. I mean, we're taught, going back to the school thing, we are taught not to trust our intuition. We're taught not to trust and have faith in that, even from our parents. And the fact is, kids are so much more in tune than we are as adults, because they haven't had all those processes yet. I mean, it's amazing when back to the unexplained, when you hear these stories about kids who know their past life, that can sit there and tell you that they were a pilot back then, or they were a designer back then, and they can tell you details that don't make any sense.
Mm.
And I know that seems crazy, but there is actual documentation to support this now, and it's just kind of like, how do you argue with that?
Yeah, especially if you have somebody saying we're all part of this, some sort of connected
Mm-hmm.
neuro pattern or however it should be described, that we're all one. That's maybe that's greatly off topic, but I've thought about what I've my current thinking on life and existence is that we are here for a reason, and that reason is to experience this, whatever it is we're experiencing, whether we signed up for it, whether we were assigned to it, or whatever reason. we're supposed to experience what's going on in life right now. So that changes a little of how I look at things from how I used to. And it, maybe it's more comforting. Yeah, I think it's more comforting because you can say, like, when you drop a glass and it breaks, why did this happen? What is this going to affect further down the line?
Well,
And
go ahead.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So, as far as existence goes, I do feel like we're probably all one eventually. And if you go with the idea that time is a disk and explained in that matter, where you could pick any point on that disk that you wanted to, what is happening right now has happened already. And what happened yesterday has happened already. And what happened in the future has happened already. And if you could skip around on this disk, you could find all those things. And then visualize or try to understand that every possibility has happened, every scenario of patterns of things working out has happened, and that's all contained in this disc or many other ones. That you get lost in those ideas, and if you read books about it or thought about it too long, it would be difficult to talk to other people about it because they're just not in that same zone you are at that point in time. One time I read a book about black holes. This was years ago, 20 years ago. And I got halfway through the book and I couldn't talk to anybody else about anything because I was so busy thinking about the stuff I'm reading in this. And you're just, it's like a computer just churning away, making the old school sounds of,
Mm-hmm.
right? And your computer is thinking that's what it's like. So it made it difficult to go to work. And I understood a little more of people that are scientists that work for an example, just being DuPont, where they're firing a neuron at something all day or an electron at something, and they're recording this and they're caught all up in this. And they have people that take them to work, that take them home, that do all their house stuff, that prepare their meals and everything because they're on a different level, maybe not a different level, but they're in a different place of thought to be able to do that job they're doing. So I wonder if that's what it's like when you're attuned to the extra metaphysical of existence. If how do you think that is?
Well, there's two things I want to say. You said this is off topic. Actually, it's not off topic because the fact of the matter is, I think the more in tuned you are, is the more creative you can be because you can get ideas and let them flow easily. As far as it, so going back to when I first started doing readings again, I did I think 13 or 14 readings in a few hour period. And the next 3 days I was drained because this is what nobody really talks about as being an intuitive person. When Andrew was saying about being plugged into that, you're plugged into that energy source. You're plugged into getting all that information, and when you're getting that information, you have to be focused on things that are happening at that time. You have to be focused on the information that may make absolutely no sense to you. And that happens a lot. So what happens is you're constantly seeing you're getting the information, you're telling what's going on to people, but it's draining for you because you're in this process. Now, once you have done it for a while, now if I were to do 13 readings, it would or 14 readings, it wouldn't be a big a deal because I've done it for a while. But I mean, I've been off for a couple months, but the fact is getting back into it, once you start getting into that flow again and you're connected, it's not as hard to be so, you know, in tuned. As far as doing something repetitive, there's also, if you're constantly trying to analyze something, and I mean, as a writer, you do that. You're analyzing constantly, is this working? What about this? And when your characters are coming to you because you are in tuned, you do kind of, you get sucked out and you have to write those notes down or you have to record those notes down because otherwise you're going to miss it. And so that's just very much like the person at DuPont, as you were saying. If he's constantly sitting there analyzing this, he doesn't have time for the mundane. And that's part of the problem with creativity is when you are in that flow of creativity, the mundane is not the easiest thing in the world because you don't have the wherewithal to get up and do everything you need to do. You want to focus on, dare I say, your world that you've created.
maybe that's why creative people seem strange, is because they're not locked into the stand in line, do this for this society that says this is what you have to do and this is what the rules you're supposed to follow, because you're plugged into this other thing out there.
Hmm.
I like that.
Hmm. I mean,
The
go ahead.
it's like a human, you're limited into what you can understand for some reason. So we're existing like this right now, and we've either forgotten how to use other senses or we're limited for some reason to experience what we can experience here. And every now and then you get to have that insight into some other sense or ability that you don't normally think about, so you don't develop it. It's that muscle that's gotten atrophied. So the human is like a resistor, and if you put too much through it, you're going to destroy it. So that's the purpose of this, is to narrow down your view.
I think that if you work on it, I mean, I often joke that I'm the reluctant medium. And the reason I say this, because when dead people started showing up, they didn't just show up. They'd let me feel how they died. And I was in the middle of a Starbucks once working with somebody because I didn't have a shop or anything, and it was a friend who's a friend of a friend, and she's like, "I need you to talk to this person." Okay, I had no knowledge of this person or anything, so I'm sitting in the middle of the Starbucks. I'm talking to this woman. I put my hand here. I'm having a hard time breathing, and I am going off, and I am telling her everything that the person who passed told his wife. I am describing in detail what was said. I am going on and on about all these little bits and pieces that were said, what he was thinking. And the woman tells me after, she's like, "You said exactly what he told her. Where your hand was is where he shot himself before he lit the room on fire." Okay. Now, how how did I know that? I don't know. And I mean, you would think that I'm in the middle of a Starbucks. So you always see it on TV and movies that it's all this woo, and I know I'm in the middle of a Starbucks, right next to where they're making drinks. And it's loud and it's obnoxious, but yet this still comes through. And I mean, the worst case was when I was in a locker room changing in the bathroom and somebody was talking about their dad and their headstone. And the dad comes along and's telling me, "Go out there and tell her I don't care about the freaking headstone. She doesn't need to go in financial problem." And I'm just like, "No, I'm not doing that." And then when I did, the woman, after this guy would just not leave me alone, when I did, the woman just looked at me like I was absolutely insane. So I don't really like being the medium. They don't show up that way anymore. They don't come to me how they died. The first person that ever did it was actually my mother, and that was not a pleasant experience. But they used to come to me and show me how they died, and I know that seems ludicrous to some people, but I have felt enough of them that it's just like, no, I don't want to do that.
I wonder why that presented itself like that. Is it because of the strong emotion they had, and that's their last connection with the here, or what do you think about that?
I think a lot of the times for me when they were coming to me, because I hadn't really studied on how to do it or anything, this was a way for me to be able to verify to the person that I was talking to, um, that it was them.
Okay, it's
Because,
like some a proof or evidence.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because how did I know? I'm sitting there with my hand here. I have no idea how this guy died. I just knew he died. And I was like, so I'm just, whatever was coming was coming. I had no, and I know a lot of people are like, "Well, you have the internet." I had no clue who I was sitting across from. It was a friend of a friend. That's all I knew. And usually, like, sometimes when you go to a reader, they'll ask for your name, and that's fine. And they don't have any time to look you up or anything. But when I get somebody sitting across from me, usually, typically, if I'm going to read their cards or do an intuitive reading, I don't ask them anything. I don't want to know anything because I don't want them to sit there and think that I've tuned in somehow to or looked them up or anything like that. So I've gotten into a habit of I don't ask them anything. You sit down, off we go. That's it. The only thing I usually ask when I'm doing a reading is, does this make sense to you?
What do you think the reason for having the cards as a mechanism of sorting out a message from between worlds or wherever you want to call it. What, why, why that? Why isn't it, is that just helping you focus on something, or is it the connection of the person, whether you're doing a simple spread or whatever, that they have the contact with that item and you do too? Or what's,
Every reader will tell you something different. My readings, for one, are a lot of psychological based. I usually will get internally because it goes back to that empath thing, um, which I'll go back to in a second. As far as the cards, for me, the cards I usually attribute to being a map. The cards focus more of the message. Otherwise, the message is just random information coming in, like Casper the Ghost. I have no idea why Casper the Ghost pops in. But then I'll say it to the client, and the client's like, oh, yes, I remember. This is what it means to me, and this is why. A song lyric that this little light of mine was playing through my head one day was this client that's sitting across from me. I have no clue. And she's like, oh, my grandma and I used to sing that. Okay. The empath part comes in when I'm sitting down, and if somebody sits down across from me, and I've had two specific ones I'm talking about right now. One was as soon as this guy sat down across from me, I felt like somebody put my heart in a vice grip.
hmm,
And as I'm reading his cards, it's showing up that he needs to get checked out. And I will never sit there and tell somebody they're going to die. That is not my job. That is unethical. I've had somebody do that to me about somebody else in my life, and all it did was make me wonder. So I told him he needed to go to the doctor. After he got up, he went and sat across the room from me and stared at me for the rest of the day, which was uncomfortable. The other person that I'm willing to share about was the fact that she was in such turmoil. I could feel the knot in her stomach as she was sitting there. She wasn't crying. She had a smile on her face, but internally I sensed that she had a knot. And usually what will happen as soon as they sit down, I start picking up on this energy. And so it's something you have to be careful of. Um, I went to Live Aid, so concerts are not a big, wasn't a big thing when I was a kid. I haven't been to a concert in a long time, and I'm not sure I could be around that kind of energy anymore. I'd like to think I could, but I mean, you tend to start picking up other people's crap. Excuse me.
so, so with doing the reading, and I guess it would be different types of energy. Are you picking up the energy from the person you're doing the reading for? And if you're, I guess the reading and a medium are different things.
Hmm.
So one is the energy from somewhere else, and the other is the energy from the person.
It isn't. It isn't. I mean, it depends on. So when you're doing an intuitive reading, we're going to say no cards. Even if you do have cards, they can still come through. Usually, when I'm doing an intuitive reading, I find myself finding one focal point. I do not look at the client. I find one focal point in the room, and then I start basically honing into that focal point. And whatever information comes, it just comes. And sometimes, yeah, somebody from the other side will show up as well. It's just one of those things where people will, the information, you don't get to be selective and say, well, I'm not going to say that. Because
Right.
sometimes, especially if it's like a relative and you're not doing what you should be doing, they're going to get sassy about it. And I will sit there and tell them exactly what is said. And they look at me and they're like, yeah, that's my grandmother or that's my mom. I mean, they will specifically tell me that it resonates. And if it doesn't, I usually can tell when a reading doesn't resonate. I will feel, and the other thing, like especially with the cards, is there's been times when I've read the cards, it did not resonate, and I knew it was basically a reading for me. Or sometimes when I'm reading for the client, their cards match up something I need to hear in the message. So
Hmm.
it's a very our energy sometimes it's kind of like what we're talking about connection. People are presented in our life. Clients are presented to me at times because what they're going through, I might need to hear that same message, and I'm just too closed off to hear it myself. But me saying it to somebody else, I can get it.
Hmm.
This is
Have
not where
you?
you thought this podcast was going to go.
Oh, I, I did my research. I know where it's going.
Okay.
Did did you think about, or do you think about the perspective of when you're, I'm not sure the word for it, the way I visualize it as this space between worlds, like to associate it with writing for a character, I would say the reason a character does what they want to sometimes, or says to you when you're writing a story that that's not how it happened, or that's not how it should happen, that it's because it's from outside of you. That idea is coming from somewhere else. It's not the manifestation of your life and experiences and you're writing about it. It's something else coming through. You're more of the antenna. And then I feel that more strongly with poetry because I visualize, I can write a poem about the here and now and make it rhyme and all that. But the bigger ideas, or the thing that makes me look at poetry and go, wow, that's amazing, is when you feel like you're connected to this other place and that it's operating through you and you're recording it down and you're probably not getting it right. And it goes back to the idea that you said of there's things that feelings or things that you're hearing that don't make sense. And I feel that a lot with poetry. It's like, this doesn't make any sense here. This doesn't make any sense here. And you finish writing it however long it takes, whether it comes all out at once or it's over days or months or however long the time is. And then you get this thing in front of you and you go, okay, this feels like this is done. And I wonder what this means. And then if you can read it and you can feel the emotion from wherever that came from when you were writing it. And it makes so much more sense now when you look at everything. And maybe it's a poem you wrote sometime in the past, and then because of events that have happened in the future from writing that, that then it means something different, or the meaning to you becomes more clear. When you're doing medium work and connecting with somewhere else, where do you visualize that, or how, what kind of visuals do you get
I don't. I
about that
mean,
in your mind?
I don't. It's weird because sometimes, like one time when somebody's grandfather came through, I saw Dare. It's I saw a girl from chest down bouncing on a man's knee. I didn't see where they were. I didn't see any avenue. Um, I didn't see anything around them, and that's the thing. It's like sometimes what I see is actual. Like the other day, I was talking to a friend, and she said something about wanting to get married somewhere, and all of a sudden, I was there, and I could see her in the dress, and I could see the guy, and I described the guy to a T, and I described the guy's eye color, and she's like, "That's my dream guy," but I had it down to exactly where it was. And when you were talking about creativity, I had a dream back, I think in 2008, that the lead character came to me and asked me, this is way before that, this is me 30-year novel. He comes to me and says, so when are you going to write my book? And I'm like, I'm not writing a book about you. But when are you going to write it? I'm like, I'm not going to write one. Just go away. And I mean, in 2010, I did publish two vampire short stories, but I I never had the confidence. That's the biggest thing about writing, is you have to be willing to lay your heart out. And so, just like you're creating this world, when I go into doing a reading, whether it's a medium reading or an intuitive reading, I don't always see everything. Sometimes they'll give me this lovely vision. I remember one of the first times when I was learning how to hone my skills. I was over at a friend's house and she's like, "Can you tell me where I'm going to get engaged at?" And like I said, I had dreams and everything when I was a kid. I've always been intuitive, but this was the moment where it's like, okay, somebody's going to start testing my skills. So I took her hands and I'm holding her hands and I'm like, got my eyes closed. She's got her eyes closed. And I'm like, okay. And I don't have to do this anymore. But at the time, this was a thought process. And I'm like, I see this beautiful, lush garden. There's this just amazing. It's just water. It's just absolutely amazing. Let's fast forward now. I get a phone call saying, you need to come to the movie theater. Deb's getting engaged. I'm like, okay, this is way off base. So she's getting engaged. It was a Star Wars movie. I love Star Wars. The first three, I don't really remember their names, so there you go, folks. I love Star Wars, but those three after you killed Darth Maul. Anyway, so she gets engaged. It was the second movie where Anakin and Padme get married. Oh, and there's that lovely, beautiful garden at the end of the movie.
By the river. right?
Yep.
Or over the water. Yeah,
With the
that's
water.
the exact thing I was thinking about when you were
Yeah.
describing it.
Yeah. That's that's what I saw.
Hmm.
So in a roundabout way, I was right. It just wasn't exactly how I pictured it, but the
Yeah,
information was there.
yeah, that's like on that Tom Cruise movie with the future crime.
I know what
I
you're
can't
talking
remember.
about. I know
Yeah,
what
I
movie
can't
you're
remember the
talking
name of
about.
it, but where he is
Minority Report.
seeing, that's it, where he's seeing this thing of the sunglasses looking through the window, and he's like, there's a person there, and then it turns out to be a billboard that's being hoisted up on the building in the future
Hmm.
there.
I mean,
Yeah,
sometimes our intuition gives us all the information, but it doesn't give us the full picture. Um, a few years ago, I kept saying I wanted to go into the city to see somebody, and I kept saying, everybody's like, well, you should stay at a cheaper hotel. And I'm like, I don't want to stay at a cheaper hotel. I need access to the elevator. And they're like, why do you need access to the elevator? I'm like, I just need access to the elevator. I didn't know why. I just knew I needed it. So, fast forward the story, I didn't stay at that hotel, but I ended up at that hotel. And as I was getting ready to go upstairs, the person that I wanted to see came out of the elevator. Like, okay, so that explained why I kept saying, and I mean, we're talking 3 to 4 months before this would happen, I kept saying, I need access to the elevator. So
yeah.
intuitively, I already knew what was going to happen.
How do you go about exercising, not like an exorcist, but exercising the ability of tuning in?
There's a couple of ways to do it. Firstly, if you read cards, we'll do that real quick. If you read cards, pull a card every day, write down, and you'll see trends, and you'll know how that works out. Because each card, I usually tell people when you're trying to read tarot, try to read intuitively. Look at the card and see what it means to you. Don't look at necessarily because each deck, as long as you're not reading with the Rider Waite, each deck is going to have a different meaning. As far as your intuition, when you get a hit, when you get an intuitive hit, or you think you know something, write it down in a journal. Write that down. I mean, even your dreams. It was funny because I was going through a dream journal back from 2001, and I found some detail in there about somebody selling T-shirts, and there was no way at the time that this person was selling T-shirts. Fast forward to when I found this in 2022, and sure enough, this person has an associate that they've helped start a T-shirt business. So you have to write things down because once you start writing down, you're going to see that those little nudges that you get, they're going to play out. They're going to be something that you need to pay attention to. And a lot of times we don't pay attention to those nudges. We just go, whatever. But if something is telling you not to do it, it's the biggest, I think the biggest thing that pushed me into taking an intuition class, like I said, I've been intuitive all my life, is I was going to work one morning and I was here now the speed limit's 70, but at the time it was not 70. And I was on the tollway and there used to be this wicked curve on the tollway. And all of a sudden I hear in my head really loudly, slow down. And I'm like, okay. So I slowed down. And as soon as I rounded the bend, traffic was at a dead stop. Had I not done that, I'd been dead. Or at least killed somebody else. So when you get those little hits, even if it's the thought of, oh, what about such and such? And if they call, well, guess what? You're in tune with that. Or you think about doing something, or you think about not doing something. Pay attention to that. Because those are those moments that are going to truly resonate with you eventually because you're going to see how it all plays out.
That's a lot like I feel about writing, where the simple statement of writers write is when you have those little ideas that come to your mind, whether it's a line in a poem or a book or just a line that you don't know where it's going to go, and or a quote from a character, whether you know who the character is or not, if you were thinking about the story or not. It's just this little thing that seems significant, and you write that down. It's easier for me now because you just put it into your phone,
Mm-hmm.
and before you know it, you have 20 pages of notes of just random things like that. But that's the difference between being able to have that material and understanding it when you're getting it that little piece at a time and be able to form it into something later. That seems like a parallel with sharpening your skills on being attuned to some other, how would you explain the median thing? Just some other place, some other realm? How do you explain
I
it?
don't even know how to explain it because I mean, it's not just
Somewhere
medium. I
else.
mean, I have a friend who, you know, she she'll like see random letters. She was looking at her sink one day and she saw a letter R. And, she's like, it pertains to you. And yes, eventually it did make sense. But I mean, she'll see a letter R or some random thing. One day I saw I kept hearing the messages in the code from a line from a song, but I kept hearing the messages in the code. I get behind somebody, there's a license plate in front of me, and the license plate reflects a certain date. And once I got that date, it was cleared. The lyric went out of my head. So sometimes when a song lyric comes into our head, it's the same thing. And as far as, I mean, I think where I get the mediumship information is the same place I get the intuitive information. It is there in the ether, and it comes down because I plug in. If I plug in searching for somebody, I mean, I don't usually go searching for the dead because I don't always like feeling them. But if somebody's like, "Well, can you ask about my grandmother?" Sometimes they'll come through because I will allow them to come through. But there's no rhyme or reason because sometimes, like I said, sometimes I'll see an image of them. Sometimes it's just a word. Sometimes it's a song. It depends on how to how to harness it at that moment because some people, this is the other thing you have to think about, because you are very capable of sending energy and blocking energy. And when I was taking my intuition class, there was a guy in my class that I particularly didn't like. And I had the opportunity, per the card that was in my hand, to send him anger. Well, that was easy to do. However, that being said, weeks later, the girl who had been sitting next to me pulled me aside outside of a grocery store that I ran across her in, and she goes, "When you were sending him anger, I had the worst headache in the world." I'm like, "What?" She goes, "As soon as you stopped, it went away. But while you were sending it, I had a headache." And then when he tried to send me some, when he was trying to search for things for me, there was some other exercise, all he saw was black because I shut him down. So it's a matter of we can control the energy, and fear and worry zap our energy a lot. And it's always a gamble to get out of the ego because the ego lives in fear and worry. But if we trust our intuition, we can live a more balanced, peaceful life. Now, I'm not going to say everything is hunky dory and I have no fear and no worry, because even though I know that things are going to be okay, the human ego of me will sit there and say, "Mm-mm, no, 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 you're wrong." So you have to be able to try to get out of the fear and worry because that really blocks our intuition. It blocks us a lot.
Huh. I, it makes sense. It makes sense, especially when I think about writing, and more so, it's just receiving those ideas from wherever they come from. Those little pieces of line, or lines of a poem, or quotes from a character, or ideas about writing, where usually for me it happens if I'm swimming, in the shower, trying to go to sleep, right before you go to sleep. So for me, water is a big thing for it, I think.
Not just for you. Water is a natural intuitive conduit. It makes us more intuitive. It's so water, especially depending where. And here's the thing: sometimes where your astrology is in your chart, yes, we're going really off base. But the more water signs you have in your chart, the more the more easy it is for you to be intuitive. Everybody is intuitive. It's just some of us have a little bit more of a oomph because of where things are placed in our chart. Um, but water is highly intuitive. When you are falling asleep, the other reason that happens is because you're in that liminal state. Your mind is not quite attached to this world. Just like me, I have a lot of prognosticating dreams. I'll have dreams that have meaning, and I'll wake up going, "Well, that was a crazy ride," but I write them down because apparently they have some meaning to them. So you have to pay attention to your dream state, and that's easy enough to do to record on your phone. You can always go back and listen to it. And the thing is, when you are, for me, 3 o'clock in the morning, my character's like in the middle of the night, hey, I got an idea. It's like, no, dude, I want to go back to sleep. I just went to the restroom. I don't need to have this. Oh, no, no, we need to talk. And I'm sure as a writer, you understand that. It's like
Yeah.
driving down the road, in the shower. You don't have time to get this down, but you have to use your phone to do it. So, I mean, technology at times is the great benefactor because it helps us be able to write down things that we can't necessarily write down at that moment. We can get it
Yeah, it
down
makes me
still.
wonder when we're more cyborgish and we have this way to remember things or work with a computer within us a little better of what else are we going to be able to figure out because we make so many other connections that just don't we don't make on a normal day because we're in this limited ability to receive and understand things.
I,
The
I've Go ahead.
that part you were talking about where you're blocking the other person or blocking whatever that message is from the ether, that ties into that when you're trying to go to sleep or you're trying to do something else and you keep getting these ideas of whatever. For me, it's writing, but you get these ideas of things where you're like, man, I like that idea, but I don't want to wake up enough to be able to write that down. And I know I'm not going to remember because I've done it plenty of times where you're like, I remember this when I wake up and you don't. So now I force myself a lot more, probably 99% of the times when I have those ideas to, if I can stop whatever I'm doing to record that idea, or if I am in that, whatever that sleep state is before sleep and not really awake, that you just go, okay, I got to write this down. And most of the time it makes sense. And if you record enough of it, when you read it, when you wake up and you've forgotten all about it and you just find it in your notes and you go, oh, what's this? And you read enough, you go, I know exactly what this is talking about. So it's in your head somewhere, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
in your head or connected to something somewhere else that's just sometimes just waiting patiently. And other times it's trying to get your attention. That's how I think you know when it's time to write a book or to write whatever is it has to come out. You
Mm-hmm.
hear writers talk about that a lot. I didn't have any choice. I had to write this. It's because that message or whatever is coming from somewhere and it's not going to be ignored anymore. You can't block it out anymore. Or if you do, you spend more energy blocking it than you do just listening.
Well, and as a creative, if you don't write, if you take 3 or 4 days off and you don't write and you don't get something out, you start getting agitated. I hear
Yeah.
that from a lot of creatives.
Yeah. I imagine the naysayers of all this type of thought or idea would say, like, for example, the lady that saw an R in the sink and then it was relative later,
Mm-hmm.
that they would just say that's just the accumulation of chance and they maybe coincidence, to which I would say there is no coincidence there, that eventually you're going to find a spot in your life to where that makes sense. And maybe
I
that's true. And maybe it's years later. Maybe you've forgotten about it and it would have made sense if you remembered it. And that's kind of how I describe deja vu to myself. It's where this is either happened before, happened on another timeline, somewhere else, events like this have unfolded, and I'm supposed to be paying attention to it for a reason, or it's telling me that this is the right path to be going at this point. I'm not sure the whole thing of what the deja vu is, but it feels like it might be one of those things where you got a signal or a sign about this, you've forgotten it, and now here's another thing that it's presented itself at the time where you should have taken this warning or this this message before for this to make more sense. So I feel like when I have the deja vu that I'm missing out on something, that I need to be more aware of what's going on. But it's also sometimes comforting because you're like, I guess this means I'm on the right track. Or either before, when I was confronted with this scenario, I made a different decision and now I need to rethink things or I'm going a different direction. I don't know. What do you think about deja vu?
Deja vu is an interesting thing, and I have something that's not really deja vu. It's I was getting ready for a podcast. I had been meditating several hours before. I was getting ready for a podcast, and I took the mic out of the box, and all of a sudden, I was here in this room. I knew I was here in this room, but in the same instance, there was an overlay of me being in a different situation, handing the box back to my sound guy, and this other person being with me, and my sound guy going, "So you don't need the mic anymore?" And the guy's like, "No, I have her taken care of." And just as quickly, I was back in this room, completely back in this room. But I saw this whole overlay. Now, how do you explain that? Don't know. Deja
Hmm.
vu? I think deja vu, it goes along those lines of we have more experiences than we realize, and it's is deja vu kind of similar to that elevator thing, where you
Hmm.
knew you felt this before, and you lived this situation maybe in a dream state that you just don't recall.
Yeah, that's like this is an extreme oversimplification, but it's like a video game. And I don't play a lot of video games, but I watched my brothers play a lot of video games growing up. And at that point in time where you're in a more involved game and you get to a point where you can save your place and then come back to it.
Hmm.
I wonder if that is a lot of the bleed through sometimes where if if life and existence is really all the scenarios happening at once and have already happened and are going to happen and all that illusion of time, that how many times have I made this decision, or is this just the spot where I saved my game in the past, and or in another reality or existence or whatever that's close to this one. So
But we can go back to Doctor Strange on that too if you want. I mean, because if you watch any of the Marvel movies, Doctor Strange in that in game movie when he is trying to run all the scenarios, and he is
hmm,
sitting there trying to run every scenario to see if they can get out of there alive, if they can survive. And when you think about it, do you not in your head when you're about to make a big decision, 9 times out of 10 you are going to run through scenarios in your head to say, okay, is this going to play out? And as a writer, you definitely run scenarios in your head because you're going to sit there and go, okay, if I make this choice, then what's going to happen with this character? And if I make this choice, what's going to happen with this character? So you have to look at all the little itty bitty pieces, and I think that's the gift of being a writer because we can look at the all those little bitty pieces affecting those characters, but sometimes that bleed through is some of the same choices we have to make in our own life. Maybe
hmm.
not on as a grander scale, but on a small scale, some of those same choices might be something we have to face eventually in our life.
That's that motif, the same idea for chess too,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm not a big chess player, but where the better you are is because you can take whatever the situation is right there and then extrapolate every move that could happen after that.
Mm-hmm.
And you just find your way through the right one. And really, that seems like what quantum computing is all about too, which is computing every scenario. And it makes sense that the farther away from whatever present point you are, that it gets more difficult to decide what is going to happen because so many more decisions have happened, so many more things you might not even be aware of that affect what's happening. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that goes back to the idea of time being this thing that you could navigate through at any point in any reality, because that's what we're here for, is to experience all those things. And if a little off topic, and if God, or what we call God, or the universe, is all of us together, all of our essences together, that maybe the reason we're broken apart into these little pieces is to experience things from all these different perspectives. And while when you read those, the Bible or other things that say, love your neighbor as yourself, is because that's just letting you know that that is you in a different time and place. And you have experienced that, and you're going to experience in the future. It's all in there, and that's why you're going through this simulation scenario reality existence that that makes your head hurt when you think about it.
Well, here's a connection thing. Okay, so yeah, I grew up in New Orleans, and May of 2008, we were down there, or 2009, we were down there, and I told my husband, I said, I need to get a Saints hat. He's like, why? I said, because the Saints are going to go to the Super Bowl. He's like, what? I said, the Saints are going to go to the Super Bowl. And we all know that, yes, growing up, the New Orleans Aints were a thing. Unknown fan bags and everything. So I buy my hat. In August, my husband says, do you want to make a bet? I'm like, no, don't even know how to make a bet. No, that's okay. So we started going to these bars and everything to watch the game and, you know, free buffet and whatever, watch the game and started watching it. Every game they started winning and winning and winning and winning. Then they had lost the one game or whatever. But we get to 2 weeks before the Super Bowl. And I have this dream. I wake up that morning because I think, for real, that the Saints have won the game. I am certain, positive that the Saints have won. Something came to me in a dream. I saw the game. They won. I knew it without a doubt. Well, that didn't happen for another 2 weeks. And they
Hmm.
all, in my dream, they almost lost the game and then they came back. Now, the interesting thing about this is the kicker who ended up kicking the winning field goal, he had a dream that he kicked the winning field goal. So, on a dream level, how many people are plugged into that? I had a dream about it. I mean, I knew that they were going to win. And every other time since then, my friends will say, "Oh, the Saints are going to make it to the Super Bowl." I'm like, "No, they're not." I don't even watch the Saints anymore. I have a jersey. I don't watch the Saints anymore. But at that moment in May, when I was down there, I knew without a doubt they were going to win. And I've known ever since, nah, not going this time. Call me a fair weather fan, that's fine. But you understand what I'm getting at. It was the point
Yeah.
of, I knew this. And then in the dream reinforced it. And I woke up, like I said, I thought they won. And John's like, the game's not in for 2 weeks.
Yeah. It's those type of things. I guess the naysayer would say a kicker would always dream about kicking the game-winning field goal before a big game.
But
But
me,
yeah, it's the other thing are those type of events make me think, and I say it often. This proves we live in a simulation. Is when that type of thing, or if you because it's already happened and you're just picking those parts out. It's not seeing the future, it's just seeing what's happened already. We're just in this spot that we're in right now, right now.
well, then
But
there's the discussion of this. Not to cut you off, but I
okay,
will. There is the
let's hear it.
discussion of this, that we are living concurrent lives, meaning either multiverse, same entity, or our past lives all at the and our future lives all at the same time.
Yeah. I, I subscribe more to that idea more often. I reserve the right to change my mind, but that's what I'm feeling right now. And then there's a lot of people, because I grew up in, going to church, and I don't think it makes me less believing in morality or, you know, treating people well and doing the right thing and not being evil to now have some different thoughts about our existence. But there's one guy that I talk to a lot that is maybe a little more religious than average. And if I would to say, if I say to him, I think we're all one, and when we're all one, that's what God is everything together is one, and it's God. And he's like, that's blasphemy to say that. And if I'm wrong and that's not the case, and I get to the point where God is like, hey, you're wrong about this, I'd be like, I was working with what I had.
Right.
It made sense. I wasn't trying to be evil about it. This is just the deal. But it makes so much sense if you think about how us that we're all connected like that. That's what the message is. Don't treat each other poorly because that's you. That, but that might be off from what we were just talking about.
No, but
But
I
the
mean,
idea,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just gonna say, I agree that, I mean, we are all connected. And if we treat everybody as a human being like we all are, it doesn't matter our ethnicity, it doesn't matter our sex, our, all that. We are all human. And that's the thing that we all kind of lose a point on, is that, sorry, that we are all human. We lose track of that. And I don't know why we lose track of that. I really
It
don't.
it's a thing that made me. I, I find it comforting to think that, and it does make me nicer to nicer people, or nicer to other people, or at least more understanding. I don't know if I'd call myself a nice person, but I'd call myself a good person. I try to be good. I'm not out there doing. I think there's a difference between good and evil, and if going back to those interview questions, what are the two type of people you wouldn't want to work with? Well, number one, it's evil people. I don't want to work with people that are evil, and I don't want to work with people that smell bad consistently and don't do anything to change it. You know, if you smell bad because this situation happened and you had to crawl through the sewer to do this thing and save this baby, and there was a kitten in a tree, and you have that whole scenario, then okay, that's good. You smell bad right now. But if you always smell bad because of you're just not taking care of things, that's a problem.
Yeah.
I would prefer to be around the person that smells bad over the evil person. But it's the idea that we're all this one thing makes me feel better, but it also makes me think there is a difference between good and evil. And now I'm still trying to wrestle with I
But
don't think you can have one without the other.
I,
So how
I would
much evil is okay?
I would agree that you can't have one without the other. But the thing is evil part of allowing? Here's the thing. So if you're intuitive and you're stepping into the flow of consciousness, then you're connected with all. You're connected with everyone. If you're being evil, then I would think you are running more on your ego because you're not there for the greater of good. You are there to eat. What would stroke the ego? Power, greed, gluttony, and maybe not gluttony, but there are other, the I don't want to say the sins, but when you think about that, a lot of it deals with the ego, which is all about me and how can I achieve and what do I need and how do I make myself better and how do I make myself bigger and larger than life. And when we talk about the corporate CEO, and when I was working as a younger person, your boss cared about you. They would give you a holiday ham, they would give you a holiday turkey. They get, and now it's like, sorry, you can't even get a day off. Sorry, you're not. That's not happening for you. It's like we've become so beholden to corporate shareholders that we do not look at the employee as a person. We look at and this was the last job I worked at, and it was in insurance. After 9/11, eventually you became a hamster on a wheel. You became somebody that you had a quota to make. You better make that quota, and that's the way it has to be. I don't care if you're closing a file and it's going to be reopened. You need to hit those numbers. It wasn't about the people that were doing the job, and
Yeah.
that's a problem. And we are not just people doing a job. And then this goes into a bigger question. Yes, this is off topic, but this goes to the bigger question of where does AI fit into this? What happens once we have AI really taking things to task and doing mental jobs? How many movies or shows have we seen where AI has taken over tasks? Star Trek Picard had something like that. We had, Terminator, of course. Terminator. Here we
Mm-hmm.
are. And I'm not saying that AI is going to take over the world right now, but if you have that in the hands of evil, it certainly could.
Yeah, it's I like Joe Rogan's view on this is that people are the sex organs of the robotic or computer world, that we're just here to do whatever we need to do to make the AI. And that seems like a real scenario to me. But then that means that the AI is it's basically a person too. It's what is a person? It's the experiences that person went through, that individual in this area or this existence has gone through, and you're just compiling that all together so it can be what we were talking about before, of if you were more of a cyborg, that you could remember all those things, receive all that information and compile it better. Well, that's what AI is going to be able to do. It's just a better it's a better human.
But
But
isn't that scary for writers? Because and unfortunately Amazon, even though that's clicking a box saying there's no AI used in your work
Yeah.
really is just anybody can check that box. But you can write a book via AI. And granted, right now, from what I've heard, it really sucks. But that doesn't mean in 5 years from now it's not going to suck. And
Oh
then
yeah.
what happens? Then what
Yeah.
happens to everybody?
Yeah. I wonder if the AI, when it feels like it's an inevitable thing.
Hmm.
And the problem is that people are programming it. So you're going to have the flaws of people in this. And I wonder if all of the information together is going to be able to come out with some sort of benevolence, maybe not benevolence, but just some sort of rational thinking, whatever that is, of the AI. Like if in essence, this to religious people will sound sacrilegious. In essence, we're making a god because it's going to be so much beyond our individual or even group human capabilities that I feel like an AI would look at humanity and just think this is a waste of my time. This, like a bird hatches out of a shell, we're the shell around the bird, and the bird's like, okay, now I'm going to go do this other thing that I'm going to go do my bird thing. That an AI that was that advanced would just leave Earth and not worry about humans. Like, why would you waste your time destroying it? It doesn't matter. Just go do something else.
Well, for giggles and grins, I mean, I hate to say it that way, but I mean, what comes
Yeah.
to mind when you're talking about this is the infamous line that I remember seeing over and over on HBO for a while back in the 80s was, "Shall we play a game?" For
Mm.
war games. I
Yeah.
mean, over and over again. I mean, think about that. If you're turning over, because we've turned over our electricity, the grid. How long before we actually, and I'm pretty sure computers are running the grids now, the power grids and everything.
Yeah.
One person hacks that stuff. I mean, here in the town I live in, it's a town of 9,000 people, and they turned off the tornado warning. We no longer have one. They turned it off because some jamoke or a kid or somebody decided to start hacking it every other morning at 2:30 in the morning.
Uh,
So instead of spending $1 million to replace it, they just turned it off. Oh, everybody's got a cell phone now.
well, that can
So,
get hacked too, but yeah.
yeah, exactly. But they're like, well, nobody needs it. So, yeah, we're just going to turn it off.
Yeah, I mean, people don't always make the best decisions and they don't always act the best way. But I hope that a conglomeration of all the experience, at least the time recorded by humanity here, put into one computer entity, some computer mind is capable of more than humans are. Like, I hope it's not as petty as people.
I hope so.
And
But you are, like you said, the computer is being programmed by a person. Go on. Sorry.
yeah, but I just wonder if you knew what everyone knew and knew what everyone knew to the point back when people started recording, like in the present time, of if you had all that information available to you, what would you think? I don't know. None of us can know that.
Did you see the movie
So that's
Wally?
what's that?
Did you see the movie Wally?
I did a long time ago. He's the
Yeah.
robot that was
Yeah. Yeah.
cleaning up Earth, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So think about that for a second. Wally, basically, Earth is decimated, and what are people left to do? Which I'm assuming that robots and AI had taken over everything because basically that's what it's presented as. So people are basically in a lounge chair with a TV stuck in front of their face and eating as much as
Yeah.
they want. Is that what our existence is going to end up being?
Yeah. I guess if you were that thing that came out of or was born out of another entity, you probably would just say, if I can let them do their own thing, I'll let them do their own thing. But if it's to my advantage for them to not do it, then I'll just get rid of them. I don't know. It's knowing the mind of everyone at once, and I don't know. I mean, obviously, as an individual, we can't know that. So it does parallel that question of how does a human know the mind of God or the universe, whatever you want to call it?
Well,
How do you know the mind of the creator?
here's the other thing. We are all connected, yet we all have different viewpoints, and that you have to question when people create propaganda, and I know this is going way off topic, but when people create propaganda, are they creating it on a level of trying to gain power and access power over people, just like a cult? So
Hmm.
when do you step back from that to realize that this is not, I need to be thinking on my own, that I need not to be thinking of the general collective? And this is where it gets dicey because I said general collective. Stepping into the flow and using your intuition and trusting the faith that something is not true, you have to really trust your intuition, but you also have to back that up by scientific facts. You also have to back it up with facts. If you're blindly trusting what everybody says, then you're not being an individual. So there's a way to be the collective, but you have to support the collective with facts, with real facts. And that's the other problem with AI, because sometimes AI can create facts that are not facts.
Right. Well, people do that a lot too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely something to think about. It's I don't know if I'm going to like stay up at night stressed about it, but I definitely think I need it deserves time to be, put into that subconscious and thought about and maybe connect with whatever other energy there is out there and see what the opinion of it is. But it's
You can't make a change. I mean, you can connect to your intuition, but you're not going to be able to make a radical world change. That's going to take us being the collective. And there was actually a person I had on the podcast who talked about if we all actually took 5 minutes a day and prayed for peace or meditated for peace, the vibrational change in the earth and in the for the world would be magnificent. It would be, he was a yogi, and it would create a different vibration and a more powerful vibration for us to all get along. But right now, because of certain positions in the world, we can't do that because everybody's listening to the banging of the drum of, well, this person, let's go to war because this person did this, when we shouldn't be in
yeah,
war at all. Because as you
yeah,
were saying
people,
earlier, we're all a little bit of each other.
yeah, people go to war
Hmm. For what? For what? Nine
for
times
people
out of ten,
things.
for what? Yeah.
Yeah, people things. Mm-mm.
So, yeah.
When you played bass, what kind of bass did you play? What was your rig set up?
I have a Yamaha BB300. I still own that bass. I used to. I had a Gorilla amp. That was the manufacturer, and it was just something I wanted to do. Somebody I admired played it, and so I decided that I wanted to be in a band in high school, and I got me a bass. And there were a few female bass players. Tina Weymouth was one, but I was more inspired by guy bass players, and it was something that I wanted to do. I moved to Texas to pursue that option with a friend. And I played on stage in a gig or two in Shreveport, but the biggest thing I ever did in Dallas was there was this guy who looked like the bass player I admired, and he had the same rig. He had a Kabiki X Factor with the extended D. So I really
Mm-hmm.
liked that bass, and so I'm looking at him. We're in this crowded bar. He's got his bass on him, and I said, "So, can you play Rio the solo?" He's like, "What?" I said, "Can you play the Rio solo?" He's like, "No, I can't play Rio at all." He goes, "Can you?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So he hands me this bass in the bar, and I have to perform right then, sitting in this chair. And yeah, I whipped it on out. And a couple of days later, that night, he's like, "Well, you'll have to come over to my house and show me." So I did. But I
Smooth
never.
lines.
He was younger than me.
Mm-hmm.
He was
Mm-hmm.
cute. He was younger than me. Nothing happened. He had a girlfriend.
Mm-hmm.
But it was one of those moments where it's like, here I am sitting in a crowded club in Dallas playing this song, and yeah, it was a big deal. But I never it was never something hard for me because my dad used to be an organist, and it wasn't that he taught me anything, but when I would have bass lessons, um, my lesson, I would go there with my friend who was learning guitar, and we were supposed to have a half hour lesson each. My lesson usually was 15 minutes, and she would take the other 45.
Hmm.
So, and my teacher was always like, "You must have practiced a lot." I'm like, "No, not really." After I learned the first song, it was just kind of after that, it was pretty simple. And
Just feeling around for the scales.
yeah, I mean, I could play better. I could have played a lot better than I did, but it's just like, as much as I enjoyed playing, now when I've tried picking it up again, I get frustrated because it's like I haven't played in 20 years. And
Yeah.
the funny thing is, during the pandemic, my husband had never heard me play. He's like, "You own a bass. I don't think you actually can play." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I can." So he had a medical appointment and he left. And at the time, John Taylor from Duran Duran was doing this bass tutorial called Stone Bass Odyssey. And he was teaching how to play Rio. And he said that he went to some party and they're like, "Can you play? Play something for us, play something for us." So he's like, "Okay," so I play Rio. And everybody looks at me and they're like, "What the hell is that?" So I'm like, "Okay, funny story. Yeah, yeah." So I practice and I play. And by the time hubby gets home, I am ready to play. And so I play it. And he looks at me and he goes, "What the hell is that?" And so I tell him, and then I tell him the
Man.
story, and I'm just like, okay. So yeah, I had to play it with the music so he would understand. But yeah,
Yeah.
so
Throw the vinyl on and go along with that.
yeah, so
My
I
brother
I
had
have
that album.
really.
Yeah.
It,
It's a good album. It's good.
it's a good album, and Rio's hard to play, and New Religion's hard to play. It's like I didn't aim for anything that was just, little simple notes. John is a bass player, and also Gary Beers from NXS. Both of them had they were never simple bass lines. They were always complicated bass lines, and that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want something to just stand there. One of the bands I was in, we did Beatles covers, and that was fine and dandy, but it wasn't something I really wanted to play all the time. So
Hmm. Yeah. I learned on a bass and then did acoustic and, six string, but
nice.
never to the point where I was considered to be good, but I was good enough for myself. Like
Yeah,
I can play what I wanted to play, but
yeah,
the bass I think is a great one to learn on just because it takes so much finger strength and you're moving your fingers around so much that once you got to the six string, that was much easier.
oh yeah,
And doing all the movements, it's hmm,
yeah. When I went to Dallas, I auditioned. I was in a band. We never actually did anything. As a backup singer for a bit. My friend wanted to audition, and she's like, "I'm only going to audition if you do." I'm like, "I'm not. I don't want to sing. I mean, I sang in the chorale group at school and stuff, but I'm not gonna." But yeah, I auditioned and I got in, and we never did anything though. But eh, it's life. I've had an interesting life. I have.
yeah. The three main topics I wanted to talk about were the writing, podcasting, and the musician stuff. And then I had a note on here to make sure I asked you about your dog and your cat because I do like animals. I saw
I
your cat earlier,
Yes,
but
that's Chloe.
how
I
are
have
the animals?
I have two dogs. I have two Cavaliers. Cammy I had gotten when she was a puppy, and Charlie, he came to me last year once again manifesting. I had told my friends, I think it was last January, I don't want another dog unless I get a tricolor Cavalier. That'll be the next dog I own. So I took Cammy to the groomer, and I forgot that my groomer doesn't take debit or credit cards. And so I had to come. She's like, "Oh, this is the benefit of living in a small town." She's like, "Oh, just come back next week and pay me." I'm like, "All right, fine." Well, the next week I ended up having to marry one of my friends, so I forgot. So the following Monday I go back in to pay her, and she looks at me. She goes, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, "I'm here to pay you." And I'm like, "Where'd you get the new dog?" And it wasn't Charlie. And she's like, "Oh, well, such and such. He has 13 dogs, and his wife's in hospice, and so he's getting rid of them,
Hmm.
and he's got a Cavalier." I'm like, "Oh, okay, what's the Cavalier look like?" "It's a tricolor." And so, long story short, I talked to him at 4 o'clock. By 5:30, Charlie was here at my house.
Hmm.
So I manifested. So what are they doing? They've both been. If you've heard any snoring in the podcast, that is Charlie or Cammy because they both snore. One is sleeping over here, and the other one is sleeping over here.
I guess
So
that sums up the book, The Secret, which is spoiler for anybody who's going to read that. You just put it out into the universe, and then there it is. But
there's
don't do
the
it too many times. Yeah.
I put out that I was going to go to Live Aid. I wanted to go to Live Aid, and I went. So yeah,
Was that the 85 one
that was the 1985 concert. Yeah,
with Queen and all that? Queen was that one, right?
Queen was in England, but
England. Okay.
Queen and Bowie were in England, but I saw the United States version.
Okay.
I won a radio. Well, my friend won the contest, but I helped her win it. So yeah. So
Well, it's a good conversation. I'm sure we could talk a lot longer.
I'm
Maybe
sure
we'll talk again in the future.
maybe.
Any thoughts or things for in closing?
If you're interested in my books, it's the Better to Burnout series. That is, I don't call it three of the books are rockstar romance books, but ultimately it's really a saga because the first book is more about his chaotic life as a addict. That is kind of there's a twist to it. But the other three are romance, kind of him winning her over and her version of events, and then them coming together and dealing with his life. As she is 18 years old and she's married her idol, and now she's faced with fans, paparazzi, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Hmm.
So I'm working on the sequel to that. There's also a standalone romantic suspense book that's set in the 90s. The other books are set in the 80s. And if you want an interesting podcast, not that I should be sharing, but we've talked about it enough, it's the Better Two podcast with DM Needom. There's 150 episodes up to get lost in. And yeah, and I do personal readings. If you're interested, you can find that on my website, which is dmneedom.com.
All right. And I'll put all those links in the show notes too. So they'll be able to see the website, the book stuff, and your podcast links and
Mm-hmm.
any other links we talk about after to put in there.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. It's a good conversation, a lot to think about. I will talk to you on the other side of this searing drum solo.